There were four of us, George and William Samuel Harris and myself and Montmorency. We were sitting in my room, smoking and talking about how bad we were. Bad from a medical point of view, I mean, of course. We were all feeling seedy, and we were getting quite nervous about it. Harris said he felt such extraordinary fits of giddiness come over him at times that he hardly knew what he was doing. And then George said that he had fits of giddiness too, and he hardly knew what he was doing. With me, it was my liver that was out of order. I knew that it was my liver that was out of order because I had just been reading a patent liver pill circular in which were detailed various symptoms by which a man could tell when his liver was out of order. I had them all. It is the most extraordinary thing, but I never read a patent medicine advertisement without being impelled to the conclusion that I am suffering from the particular disease therein dealt with in its most virulent form. The diagnosis seems in every case to correspond exactly with all the sensations that I have ever felt. I remember going to the British Museum one day to read up the treatment for some slight ailment of which I had a touch. Hay fever, I fancy it was. I got down the book and read all I came to read, and then, in an unthinking moment, I idly turned the leaves and began to indolently study diseases generally. I forget which was the first distemper I plunged into. Some fearful, devastating scourge, I know. And before I had glanced half down the list of premonitory symptoms, it was borne in upon me that I had fairly got it. I sat for a while, frozen with horror. And then, in the listlessness of despair, I again turned over the pages. I came to typhoid fever, must have had it for months without knowing it, and wondered what else I had got. Turned up St. Vitus's dance, found, as I expected, that I had it too. Began to get interested in my case and determined to sift it to the bottom. And so started alphabetically. Read up ague and learnt that I was sickening for it, and that the acute stage would commence in about another fortnight. Bright's disease, I was relieved to find, I had only in a modified form, and so far as that was concerned, I might live for years. Cholera I had, with severe complications, and diphtheria I seemed to have been born with. I plodded conscientiously through the 26 letters, and the only malady I could conclude I had not got was housemaid's knee. I felt rather hurt about this at first. It seemed somehow to be a sort of slight. Why hadn't I got housemaid's knee? Why this invidious reservation? After a while, however, less grasping feelings prevailed. I reflected that I had every other known malady in the pharmacology, and I grew less selfish and determined to do without housemaid's knee. Gout, in its most malignant stage, it would appear, had seized me without my being aware of it, and zymosis I'd evidently been suffering with from boyhood. There were no more diseases after zymosis, so I concluded there was nothing else the matter with me. I sat and pondered. I thought, what an interesting case I must be from a medical point of view. What an acquisition I should be to a class. Students would have no need to walk the hospitals if they had me. No, I was a hospital in myself. All they need to do would be to walk round me, and after that, take their diploma. Then I wondered how long I had to live. I tried to examine myself. I felt my pulse. I could not at first feel any pulse at all, and then all of a sudden, it seemed to start off. I pulled out my watch and timed it. I made it 147 to the minute. I tried to feel my heart. I could not feel my heart. I have since been induced to come to the opinion that it must have been there all the time and must have been beating, but I cannot account for it. I patted myself all over my front, from what I call my waist up to my head, and I went a bit round each side and a little way up the back, but I could not feel or hear anything. I tried to look at my tongue. I stuck it out as far as ever it would go, and I shut one eye and tried to examine it with the other. I could only see the tip, and the only thing that I could gain from that was to feel more certain than ever before that I had scarlet fever. I walked into that reading room a happy, healthy man. I crawled out a decrepit wreck. I went to my medical man. Now, he's an old chum of mine and feels my pulse and looks at my tongue and talks about the weather, all for nothing when I fancy that I'm ill. So I thought I would do him a good turn by going to him now. What a doctor wants, I said, is practice. He shall have me. He will get more practice out of me than out of 1,700 of your ordinary, commonplace patients with only 1 or 2 diseases each. So I went straight up and saw him, and he said,
"Well, what's the matter with you?"
I said, "I will not take up your time, dear boy, with telling you what is the matter with me, for life is brief and you might pass away before I have finished. But I will tell you what is not the matter with me. I have not got housemaid's knee. Why I have not got housemaid's knee I cannot tell you, but the fact remains that I have not got it. Everything else, however, I have got." And I told him how I came to discover it all. Then he opened me and looked down me and clutched hold of my wrist, and then he hit me over the chest when I wasn't expecting it. After that, he sat down and wrote out a prescription, and folded it up and gave it to me, and I put it into my pocket and went out. I did not open it. I took it to the nearest chemist's and handed it in. The man read it and then handed it back. He said he didn't keep it. I said, "Well, you're a chemist." He said, "I am a chemist. If I was a cooperative stores and family hotel combined, I might be able to oblige you. Being only a chemist hampers me." I read the prescription. It ran, 1 pound beefsteak with 1 pint bitter beer every 6 hours, 1 10-mile walk every morning, 1 bed at 11 sharp every night, and don't stuff up your head with things you don't understand. I followed the directions, with the happy result, speaking for myself, that my life was preserved and is still going on. In the present instance, going back to the liver pill circular, I had the symptoms beyond all mistake, the chief amongst them being a general disinclination to work of any kind. We sat there for half an hour, describing to each other our maladies, and I explained to George and William Harris how I felt when I got up in the morning, and William Harris told us how he felt when he went to bed, and George stood on the hearthrug and gave us a clever and powerful piece of acting, illustrative of how he felt in the night. "What we want is rest," said Harris. "Rest and a complete change," said George. "The overstrain upon our brains has produced a general depression throughout the system. A change of scene and absence of the necessity for thought will restore the mental equilibrium." George has a cousin who is usually described in the charge sheet as a medical student, so that he naturally has a somewhat physicianary way of putting things. I agreed with George and suggested that we should seek out some retired old-world spot, far from the madding crowd, and dream away a sunny week among its drowsy lanes. Some half-forgotten nook, hidden away by the fairies, out of reach of the noisy world. Some quaint perched eyrie on the cliffs of time, from whence the surging waves of the 19th century would sound far off and faint. Harris said he thought it would be humpy. He said he knew the sort of place I meant, where everybody went to bed at 8 o'clock and you couldn't get a sporting paper for love nor money, and had to walk 10 miles to get your baccy. "No," said Harris. "If you want rest and change, you can't beat a sea trip." I objected to a sea trip strongly. A sea trip does you good when you're going to have a couple of months of it, but for a week it is wicked. You start on Monday with the idea implanted in your bosom that you're going to enjoy yourself. You wave an airy adieu to the boys on shore, light your biggest pipe, and swagger about the deck as if you were Captain Cook, Sir Francis Drake, and Sir Christopher Columbus all rolled into one. On Tuesday, you wish you hadn't come. On Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, you wish you were dead. On Saturday, you're able to swallow a little beef tea and to sit up on deck and answer with a wan, sweet smile when kind-hearted people ask how you feel now. On Sunday, you begin to walk again and take solid food. And on Monday morning, as with your bag and umbrella in your hand, you stand by the gunwale, waiting to step ashore, you begin to thoroughly like it. I remember a fellow who went for a week's voyage on the coast, and before they started, the steward came to him to ask whether he would pay for each meal as he had it, or arrange beforehand for the whole series. The steward recommended the latter course, as it would come so much cheaper. He said they would do him the whole week at £2.05. He said for breakfast there would be fish, followed by a grill. Lunch was at 1 and consisted of 4 courses. Dinner at 6, soup, fish, entree, joint, poultry, salad, sweets, cheese and dessert, and a light meat supper at 10. My friend thought he would close on the £2.5 job. He is a hearty eater, and did so. Lunch came just as they were off Sheerness. He didn't feel so hungry as he thought he should, and so contented himself with a bit of boiled beef and some strawberries and cream. He pondered a good deal during the afternoon, and at one time it seemed to him that he'd been eating nothing but boiled beef for weeks, and at other times it seemed that he must have been living on strawberries and cream for years. Neither the beef nor the strawberries and cream seemed happy either. Seemed discontented like. At 6, they came and told him dinner was ready. The announcement aroused no enthusiasm within him, but he felt that there was some of that £2.5 to be worked off, and he held onto the ropes and things and went down. A pleasant odour of onions and hot ham mingled with fried fish and greens greeted him at the bottom of the ladder, and then the steward came up with an oily smile and said, "What can I get you, sir?"
"Oh, get me out of this,"
was the feeble reply. And they ran him up quick and propped him up over to leeward and left him. For the next 4 days he lived a simple and blameless life on thin captain's biscuits. I mean the biscuits were thin, not the captain, and soda water. But towards Saturday he got uppish and went in for weak tea and dry toast, and on Monday he was gorging himself on chicken broth. He left the ship on Tuesday, and as it steamed away from the landing stage, he gazed after it regretfully. "There she goes," he said. "There she goes with £2 worth of food on board that belongs to me and that I haven't had." He said that if they'd given him another day, he thought he could have put it straight. So I set my face against the sea trip. Not, as I explained, upon my own account. I was never queer. But I was afraid for George. George said he should be all right and would rather like it, but he would advise Harris and me not to think of it, as he felt sure that we should both be ill. Harris said that, to himself, it was always a mystery how people managed to get sick at sea. Said he thought people must do it on purpose, from affectation. Said he often wished to be, but had never been able. It's a curious fact, but nobody is ever seasick on land. At sea, you come across plenty of people who are very bad indeed, whole boats of them, but I never met a man yet on land who'd ever known at all what it was to be seasick. Where the thousands upon thousands of bad sailors that swarm in every ship hide themselves when they're on land is a mystery. If most men were like a fellow I saw on the Yarmouth boat one day, I could account for the seeming enigma easily enough. It was just off Southend Pier, I recollect, and he was leaning out through one of the portholes in a very dangerous position. I went up to him to try and save him. "Hi, come further in," I said, shaking him by the shoulder. "You'll be overboard."
"Oh, my, I wish I was,"
was the only answer I could get. 3 weeks afterwards, I met him in the coffee room of a Bath hotel, talking about his voyages and explaining with enthusiasm how he loved the sea. "Ha! Good sailor!" he replied, in answer to a mild young man's envious query. "Well, I did feel a little queer once, I confess. It was off Cape Horn. The vessel was wrecked next morning." I said, "Weren't you a little shaky by Southend Pier one day and wanted to be thrown overboard?" "Southend Pier?" he replied, with a puzzled expression. "Yes, going down to Yarmouth last Friday 3 weeks. "Oh, ha, yes," he answered, brightening up. "Yes, I remember now. I did have a headache that afternoon. It was the pickles, you know. They were the most disgraceful pickles I ever tasted in a respectable boat. Did you have any?" George said, "Let's go up the river." He said we should have fresh air, exercise and quiet. The constant change of scene would occupy our minds, including what there was of Harris's, and the hard work would give us a good appetite and make us sleep well. Harris said he didn't think George ought to do anything that would have a tendency to make him sleepier than he always was, as it might be dangerous. He said he didn't very well understand how George was going to sleep any more than he did now, seeing that there were only 24 hours in each day, summer and winter alike. but thought if he did sleep any more, he might just as well be dead, and so save his board and lodging. Harris said, however, that the river would suit him to a T. I don't know what a T is, but it seems to suit everybody, however, which is greatly to its credit. It suited me to a T, too, and Harris and I both said that it was a good idea of George's. And we said it in a tone that seemed somehow to imply that we were surprised that George should have come out so sensible. The only one who was not struck with the suggestion was Montmorency. He never did care for the river, did Montmorency.
"It's all very well for you fellows,"
he says.
"You like it, but I don't. There's nothing for me to do. Scenery is not in my line, and I don't smoke. If I see a rat, you won't stop. And if I go to sleep, you get fooling about with a boat and slop me overboard. If you ask me, I call the whole thing bally foolishness."
We were 3-1, however, and the motion was carried. We pulled out maps and discussed plans. We arranged to start on the following Saturday from Kingston. Harris and I would go down in the morning and take the boat up to Chertsey, and George, who would not be able to get away from the city till the afternoon, George goes to sleep at a bank from 10 to 4 each day, except Saturdays, when they wake him up and put him outside at 2, would meet us there. Should we camp out or sleep at inns? George and I were for camping out. We said it would be so wild and free, so patriarchal-like. Slowly, the golden memory of the dead sun fades from the hearts of the cold, sad clouds. Silent, like sorrowing children, the birds have ceased their song, and only the moorhen's plaintive cry and the harsh croak of the corncrake stirs the awed hush around the couch of waters where the dying day breathes out her last. Then we run our little boat into some quiet nook, and the tent is pitched and the frugal supper cooked and eaten. Then the big pipes are filled and lighted, and the pleasant chat goes round in musical undertone, while, in the pauses of our talk, the river, playing round the boat, prattles strange old tales and secrets, sings low the child's song that it has sung so many thousand years, will sing so many thousand years to come, before its voice grows harsh and old. A song that we, who have learnt to love its changing face, who have so often nestled on its yielding bosom, think somehow we understand, though we could not tell you in mere words the story that we listened to. Harris said, "How about when it rained?" Oh, you never can rouse Harris. There is no poetry about Harris, no wild yearning for the unattainable. Harris never weeps he knows not why. If Harris's eyes fill with tears, you can bet it's because Harris has been eating raw onions or has put too much Worcester over his chop. If you were to stand at night by the seashore with Harris and say, "Hark! Do you not hear? It is but the mermaids singing deep below the waving waters, or sad spirits chanting dirges for white corpses held by seaweed." Harris would take you by the arm and say, "I know what it is, old man. You've got a chill. Now you come along with me. I know a place round the corner here where you can get a drop of the finest Scotch whisky you ever tasted. Put you right in less than no time." Harris always does know a place round the corner where you can get something brilliant in the drinking line. I believe that if you met Harris up in Paradise, supposing such a thing likely, he would immediately greet you with, "Oh, so glad you've come, old fellow. I've found a nice place round the corner here where you can get some really first-class nectar." In the present instance, however, as regarding the camping out, his practical view of the matter came as a very timely hint. Camping out in rainy weather is not pleasant. It is evening. You are wet through, and there's a good 2 inches of water in the boat, and all the things are damp. You find a place on the bank that is not quite so puddly as the other places you have seen, and you land and lug out the tent, and 2 of you proceed to fix it. It is soaked and heavy, and it flops about and tumbles down upon you, and clings round your head and makes you mad. The rain is pouring steadily down all the time. It is difficult enough to fix a tent in dry weather. In wet, the task is Herculean. Instead of helping you, It seems to you that the other man is simply playing the fool. Just as you get your side beautifully fixed, he gives a hoist from his end and spoils it all. "Here, what are you up to?" you call out. "What are you up to?" he retorts. "Let go, can't you?" "Don't pull it! You've got it all wrong, you stupid ass!" you shout. "No, I haven't," he yells back. "Let go your side!" "I tell you, you've got it all wrong," you roar, wishing that you could get at him, and with that you give your ropes a lug that pulls all his pegs out. "Oh, the bally idiot," you hear him mutter to himself, and then comes a savage haul, and away goes your side. You lay down the mallet and start to go round and tell him what you think about the whole business, and at the same time he starts round in the same direction to come and explain his views to you, and you follow each other round and round, swearing at each other, until the tent tumbles down in a heap and leaves you looking at each other across its ruins. Then you both exclaim indignantly and in the same breath, "Ah, there you are! What did I tell you?" Meanwhile, the third man, who's been bailing out the boat and who has spilled the water down his sleeve and has been cursing away to himself steadily for the last 10 minutes, wants to know what the thundering blazes you're playing at and why the blasted tent isn't up yet. At last, somehow or other, it does get up, and you land the things. It is hopeless attempting to make a wood fire, so you light the methylated spirit stove and crowd round that. Rainwater is the chief article of diet at supper. The bread is 2/3 rainwater, the beefsteak pie is exceedingly rich in it, and the jam and the butter and the salt and the coffee have all combined with it to make soup. After supper, you find your tobacco is damp and you cannot smoke. Luckily, you have a bottle of the stuff that cheers and inebriates, if taken in proper quantity, and this restores to you sufficient interest in life to induce you to go to bed. There you dream that an elephant has suddenly sat down on your chest and that a volcano has exploded and thrown you down to the bottom of the sea, the elephant still sleeping peacefully on your bosom. You wake up and grasp the idea that something terrible really has happened. Your first impression is that the end of the world has come, and then you think, this cannot be. It is thieves and murderers, or else fire. And this opinion you express in the usual method. No help comes, however, and all you know is that thousands of people are kicking you and you are being smothered. Somebody else seems in trouble too. You can hear his faint cries coming from beneath your bed. Determining at all events to sell your life dearly, you struggle frantically, hitting out right and left with your arms and legs, and yelling lustily the while, and at last something gives way, and you find your head in the fresh air. 2 feet off, you dimly observe a half-dressed ruffian waiting to kill you, and you're preparing for a life-and-death struggle with him, when it begins to dawn upon you that it's Jim. "Oh, it's you, is it?" he says, recognizing you at the same moment. "Yes," is the answer, rubbing your eyes. "What's happened?" "Barely tent's blown down, I think," he says. "Where's Bill?" And you both raise up your voices and shout for Bill, and the ground beneath you heaves and rocks, and the muffled voice that you heard before replies from out of the ruin, "Get off my head, can't you?" And Bill struggles out, a muddy, trampled wreck. And, in an unnecessarily aggressive mood, he being under the evident belief that the whole thing has been done on purpose. In the morning, you are all three speechless, owing to having caught severe cold in the night. You also feel very quarrelsome, and you swear at each other in hoarse whispers during the whole of breakfast time. We therefore decided that we would sleep out on fine nights, and hotel it, and inn it, and pub it, like respectable folks, when it was wet, or when we felt inclined for a change. Montmorency hailed this compromise with much approval. He does not revel in romantic solitude. Give him something noisy, and, if a trifle low, so much the jollier. To look at Montmorency, you would imagine that he was an angel, sent upon the earth for some reason withheld from mankind in the shape of a small fox terrier. There's a sort of, "Oh, what a wicked world this is, and how I wish I could do something to make it better and nobler," expression about Montmorency that's been known to bring the tears into the eyes of pious old ladies and gentlemen. When first he came to live at my expense, I never thought I should be able to get him to stop long. I used to sit down and look at him, as he sat on the rug and looked at me, and think, "Oh, that dog will never live. He will be snatched up to the bright skies in a chariot. That's what will happen to him. But when I had paid for about a dozen chickens that he had killed and had dragged him, growling and kicking by the scruff of his neck, out of 114 street fights, and had had a dead cat brought round for my inspection by an irate female who called me a murderer, and had been summoned by the man next door but one for having a ferocious dog at large that had kept him pinned up in his own tool shed, afraid to venture his nose outside the door for over 2 hours on a cold night, and had learned that the gardener, unknown to myself, had won 30 shillings by backing him to kill rats against time, then I began to think that maybe they'd let him remain on earth for a bit longer after all. To hang about a stable and collect a gang of the most disreputable dogs to be found in the town and lead them out to march round the slums to fight other disreputable dogs is Montmorency's idea of life. And so, as I before observed, he gave to the suggestion of inns and pubs and hotels his most emphatic approbation. Having thus settled the sleeping arrangements to the satisfaction of all four of us, the only thing left to discuss was what we should take with us. And this we had begun to argue when Harris said he'd had enough oratory for one night and proposed that we should go out and have a smile, saying that he'd found a place round by the square where you could really get a drop of Irish worth drinking. George said he felt thirsty. I never knew George when he didn't. And as I had a presentiment that a little whiskey, warm with a slice of lemon, would do my complaint good, the debate was by common assent adjourned to the following night, and the assembly put on its hats and went out. The three of us, that's George, Harris, and myself, had decided to take a holiday trip up the River Thames. The only one who was not struck by the suggestion was Montmorency, the dog, but he was outvoted. So, on the following evening, we again assembled to discuss and arrange our plans. Harris said, "Now, the first thing to settle is what to take with us. Now, you get a bit of paper and write down, Jay, and you get the grocery catalogue, George, and somebody give me a bit of pencil, and I'll make out a list." Oh, that's Harris all over. So ready to take the burden of everything himself and put it on the backs of other people. I said, "No, you get the paper and the pencil and the catalogue, and George write down, and I'll do the work." The first list we made out had to be discarded. It was clear that the upper reaches of the Thames wouldn't allow for the navigation of a boat sufficiently large to take the things that we'd set down as indispensable, so we tore the list up and looked at one another. George said, "You know, we're on the wrong track altogether. We must not think of things we could do with, but only of the things that we can't do without." Well, we left the list to George, and he began it. "We won't take a tent," suggested George. "No, we'll have a boat with a cover. It's ever so much simpler and more comfortable." It seemed a good thought, and we adopted it. I don't know whether you've ever seen the thing I mean, but you fix iron hoops up over the boat and stretch a huge canvas over them and fasten it down all round from stem to stern, and it converts the boat into a sort of little house. And it's beautifully cosy, though a trifle stuffy. George said that in that case we must take a rug each, a lamp, some soap, a brush and comb, between us, a toothbrush each, a basin, some tooth powder, some shaving tackle. It sounds like a French exercise, doesn't it? And a couple of big towels for bathing. I notice that people always make gigantic arrangements for bathing when they're going anywhere near the water, but they don't bathe much when they're there. In the present instance, we all talked as if we were going to have a long swim every morning. George said it was so pleasant to wake up in the boat in the fresh morning and plunge into the limpid river. And Harry said there was nothing like a swim before breakfast to give you an appetite. He said it always gave him an appetite. George said that if he was going to make Harris eat more than Harris ordinarily ate, then he should protest against Harris having a bath at all. He said it'd be quite enough hard work in towing sufficient food for Harris up against stream as it was. I urged upon George, however, how much pleasanter it would be to have Harris clean and fresh about the boat, even if we did have to take a few more hundredweight of provisions. And he got to see it in my light, and withdrew his opposition to Harris's bath. Agreed, finally, that we should take 3 bath towels so as not to keep each other waiting. For clothes, George said 2 suits of flannel would be sufficient, as we could wash them ourselves in the river when they got dirty. We asked him if he'd ever tried washing flannels in the river, and he replied, no, not exactly himself-like, but he knew some fellows who had, and it was easy enough. And Harris and I were weak enough to fancy that he knew what he was talking about, and that 3 respectable young men, without position or influence, and with no experience in washing, could really clean their own shirts and trousers in the River Thames with a bit of soap. We were to learn, in the days to come, when it was too late, that George was a miserable impostor, who could evidently have known nothing whatever about the matter. If you had seen these clothes after... But, as the shilling shockers say, we anticipate. Then we discussed the food question, and George said, begin with breakfast. Now, for breakfast, we shall want a frying pan. Harris said it was indigestible, but we merely urged him not to be an ass, and George went on. A teapot and a kettle and a methylated spirit stove. No oil, said George, with a significant look. And Harris and I agreed. We had taken up an oil stove once, but never again. It had been like living in an oil shop that week. It oozed. I never saw such a thing as paraffin oil is to ooze. We kept it in the nose of the boat, and from there it oozed down to the rudder, impregnating the whole boat and everything in it on its way, and it oozed over the river and saturated the scenery and spoilt the atmosphere. Sometimes a westerly oily wind blew, and at other times an easterly oily wind, and sometimes it blew a northerly oily wind, and maybe a southerly oily wind. But whether it came from the Arctic snows or was raised in the waste of the desert sands, it came alike to us, laden with the fragrance of paraffin oil. We tried to get away from it at Marlow. We left the boat by the bridge and took a walk through the town to escape it, but it followed us. The whole town was full of oil. We passed through the churchyard, and it seemed as if the people had been buried in oil. The high streets stank of oil, and we wondered how people could live with it. And we walked miles upon miles out Birmingham way, but it was no use. The country was steeped in oil. At the end of that trip, we met together at midnight in a lonely field under a blasted oak, and took an awful oath. We'd been swearing for a whole week about the thing in an ordinary middle-class way, but this was a swell affair, an awful oath never to take paraffin oil with us in a boat again, except, of course, in case of sickness. Therefore, in the present instance, we confined ourselves to methylated spirit. But even that is bad enough. You get methylated pie and methylated cake. But methylated spirit is more wholesome when taken into the system in large quantities than paraffin oil. For other things, George suggested eggs and bacon, which were easy to cook, cold meat, tea, bread and butter and jam. For lunch, he said, we could have biscuits, cold meat, bread and butter and jam, but no cheese. Cheese, like oil, makes too much of itself. It wants the whole boat to itself. It goes through the hamper and gives a cheesy flavour to everything else there. You can't tell whether you're eating apple pie or German sausage or strawberries and cream. No, it all seems cheese. There's too much odour about cheese. You know, I remember a friend of mine buying a couple of cheeses at Liverpool. Oh, splendid cheeses they were, ripe and mellow, and with a 200 horsepower scent about them that might have been warranted to carry 3 miles and knock a man over at 200 yards. I was in Liverpool at the time, and my friend said that if I didn't mind, he would get me to take them back with me to London, as he should not be coming up for a day or two himself, and he did not think the cheese ought to be kept much longer. Oh, with pleasure, dear boy, I replied. Oh, yes, with pleasure. I called for the cheeses and took them away in a cab. It was a ramshackle affair, dragged along by a knock-kneed, broken-winded somnambulist, which his owner, in a moment of enthusiasm during conversation, referred to as a horse. I put the cheeses on the top, and we started off at a shamble that would have done credit to the swiftest steamroller ever built. And all went merrily as a funeral bell until we turned a corner, and there the wind carried a whiff from the cheeses full on our steed. It woke him up, and with a snort of terror he dashed off at 3 miles an hour. The wind still blew in his direction, and before we reached the end of the street he was laying himself out at a rate of nearly 4 miles an hour, leaving the cripples and stout old ladies simply nowhere. It took 2 porters, as well as the driver, to hold him in at the station, And I don't think they'd have done it, even then, had not one of the men had the presence of mind to put a handkerchief over his nose and to light a bit of brown paper. I took my ticket and marched proudly up the platform with my cheeses, the people falling back respectfully on either side. The train was crowded, and I had to get into a carriage where there were already 7 other people. One crusty old gentleman objected, but I got in, notwithstanding, and putting my cheeses upon the rack, squeezed down with a pleasant smile and said, it was a warm day. A few moments passed, and then the old gentleman began to fidget. Yes, it's very close in here, he said. Yes, quite oppressive, said the man next to him. And then they both began sniffing, and at the third sniff, they caught it right on the chest and rose up without another word and went out. And then a stout lady got up and said it was disgraceful that a respectable married woman should be harried about in this way, and got her bag and 8 parcels and went out. The remaining 4 passengers sat on for a while until a solemn-looking man in the corner, who, from his dress and general appearance, seemed to belong to the undertaker class, said, "To put him in mind of a dead baby." And the other 3 passengers tried to get out of the door at the same time and hurt themselves. I smiled at the solemn gentleman and said that I thought we were going to have the carriage to ourselves, and he laughed pleasantly and said that some people made such a fuss over a little thing. But even he grew strangely depressed after we'd started, and so, when we reached Crewe, I asked him to come and have a drink. He accepted, and we forced our way into the buffet, where we yelled and stamped and waved our umbrellas for a quarter of an hour, and then a young lady came and asked us if we wanted anything. "What's yours?" I said, turning to my friend. "I'll have half a crown's worth of brandy, neat, if you please, miss," he responded. And he went off quietly after he'd drunk it, and got into another carriage, which I thought mean. From Euston, I took the cheeses down to my friend's house, and when his wife came into the room, she smelt round for an instant, and then she said, "What is it? Tell me the worst." And I said, "It's the cheeses. Tom bought them in Liverpool, and he asked me to bring them up with me." And I added that I hoped that she understood that it had nothing to do with me, and she said she was sure of that, but that she would speak to Tom about it when he came back. My friend was detained in Liverpool longer than he expected, and 3 days later, as he hadn't returned home, his wife called on me. She said, "What did Tom say about those cheeses?" I replied that he had directed me that they were to be kept in a moist place and that nobody was to touch them. She said, "No one's likely to touch them. Had he smelt them?" I thought he had, and added that he seemed greatly attached to them. "You think he'd be upset," she queried, "if I gave a man a sovereign to take them away and bury them?" I answered that I thought he would never smile again. An idea struck her. She said, "Do you mind keeping them for him? Let me send them round to you." "Madam," I replied, "for myself I like the smell of cheese, and the journey the other day with them from Liverpool I shall ever look back upon as a happy ending to a pleasant holiday. But in this world we must consider others. The lady under whose roof I had the honour of residing is a widow, and for all I know, possibly an orphan too. She has a strong, I must say, eloquent objection to being what she terms put upon. The presence of your husband's cheese in her house she would, I instinctively feel, regard as a put upon. And it shall never be said that I put upon the widow and the orphan." "Oh, very well then," said my friend's wife, rising. "All I have to say is that I shall take the children and go to an hotel until those cheeses are eaten. I decline to live any longer in the same house with them." She kept her word, leaving the place in charge of the charwoman, who, when asked if she could stand the smell, replied, "What smell?" and who, when taken close to the cheese and told to sniff hard, said she could detect a faint odour of melons. It was argued from this that little injury could result to the woman from the atmosphere, and she was left. The hotel bill came to 15 guineas, and my friend, after reckoning everything up, found that the cheeses had cost him 8 and 6pence a pound. He said he dearly loved a bit of cheese, but it was beyond his means, so he got rid of them at last by taking them down to a seaside town and burying them on the beach. It gained the place quite a reputation. Visitors said they had never noticed before how strong the air was, and weak-chested and consumptive people used to throng there for years afterwards. Fond as I am of cheese, therefore, I hold that George was right in declining to take any. We shan't want any tea," said George, and Harris's face fell at this. "But we'll have a good round, square, slap-up meal at 7, dinner, tea, and supper combined." Harris grew more cheerful. George suggested meat and fruit pies, cold meat, tomatoes, fruit and green stuff. For drink, we took some wonderful sticky concoction of Harris's, which you mix with water and called lemonade. Plenty of tea and a bottle of whisky, in case, as George said, we got upset. Well, it seemed to me that George harped too much on the getting upset idea. It seemed to me the wrong spirit to go about the trip in. But I'm glad we took the whisky. We made a list of things to be taken, and a pretty lengthy one it was, before we parted that evening. The next day, which was Friday, we got them all together and met in the evening to pack. We got a big Gladstone for the clothes and a couple of hampers for the victuals and cooking utensils. We moved the table up against the window, piled everything in a heap in the middle of the floor, and sat round and looked at it. I said I'd pack. I rather pride myself on my packing. Packing is one of those many things that I feel I know more about than any other person living. It surprises me myself sometimes how many of these subjects there are. I impressed the fact upon George and Harris and told them that they had better leave the whole matter entirely to me. They fell into the suggestion with a readiness that had something uncanny about it. George put on a pipe and spread himself over the easy chair, and Harris cocked his legs on the table and lit a cigar. It seemed a longer job than I thought it was going to be, but I got the bag finished at last, and I sat on it and strapped it. Aren't you going to put the boots in? Said Harris. And I looked around and found that I'd forgotten them. Oh, that's just like Harris. He couldn't have said a word till I got the bag shut and strapped, of course. Oh, no. And George laughed, one of those irritating, senseless, chuckle-headed, crack-jawed laughs of his. Oh, they do make me wild. I opened the bag and packed the boots in, and then, just as I was going to close it, a horrible idea occurred to me. Had I packed my toothbrush? I don't know how it is, but I never do know whether I've packed my toothbrush. My toothbrush is a thing that haunts me when I'm travelling. It makes my life a misery. I dream that I haven't packed it and wake up in a cold perspiration, get out of bed and hunt for it. And in the morning, I pack it before I have used it, and I have to unpack again and get it. And it is always the last thing I turn out of my bag. And then I repack and forget it, and have to rush upstairs for it at the last moment and carry it to the railway station wrapped up in my pocket handkerchief. Of course, I had to turn every mortal thing out now, and of course I could not find it. I rummaged the things up into the same state as they must have been before the world was created, and when chaos reigned. And of course I found George's and Harris's 18 times over, but I could not find my own. I put things back one by one and held everything up and shook it. Then I found it, inside a boot. I repacked once more. When I'd finished, George asked if the soap was in. I said I didn't care a hang whether the soap was in or whether it wasn't, and I slammed the bag to and strapped it, and found that I had packed my tobacco pouch in it and had to reopen it. Well, it got finally shut at 10:05 p.m. And then there remained the hampers to do. Harry said that we should be wanting to leave in less than 12 hours' time, and thought that he and George had better do the rest, and I agreed and sat down, and they had a go. Well, they began in a light-hearted spirit, evidently intending to show me how to do it. I made no comment. I only waited. When George is hanged, Harris will be the worst packer in this world. And I looked at the pile of plates and cups and kettles and bottles and jars and pies and stoves and cakes and tomatoes, etc., and felt that the thing would soon become exciting. It did. They started with breaking a cup, and that was the first thing they did. They did that just to show what they could do and to get you interested. Then Harris packed the strawberry jam on top of a tomato and squashed it, and they had to pick out the tomato with a teaspoon. And then it was George's turn, and he trod on the butter. I didn't say anything, but I came over and sat on the edge of the table and watched them. It irritated them more than anything that I could have said. I felt that. It made them nervous and excited, and they stepped on things and put things behind them, and then they couldn't find them when they wanted them, and they packed the pies at the bottom and put heavy things on top and smashed the pies in. They upset salt over everything. And as for the butter, I never saw two men do more with 1 and 2pence worth of butter in my whole life than they did. After George had got it off his slipper, they tried to put it in the kettle. It wouldn't go in, and what was in wouldn't come out. They did scrape it out at last and put it down on a chair, and Harris sat on it, and it stuck to him, and they went looking for it all over the room. "I'll take my oath I put it down on that chair," said George, staring at the empty seat. "But I saw you do it myself not a minute ago," said Harris. And they started round the room looking for it, and then they met again in the centre and stared at one another. "Most extraordinary thing I ever heard of," said George. "It's so mysterious," said Harris. Then George got round the back of Harris and saw it. "Why, here it is all the time," he exclaimed indignantly. "Where?" cried Harris, spinning round. "Oh, stand still, can't you?" roared George, flying after him. And they got it off and packed it in the teapot. Montmorency was in it all, of course. Now, Montmorency's ambition in life is to get in the way and to be sworn at. If he can squirm in anywhere where he particularly is not wanted and be a perfect nuisance and make people mad and have things thrown at his head, then he feels his day has not been wasted. To get somebody to stumble over him and curse him steadily for an hour is his highest aim and object. And when he's succeeded in accomplishing this, his conceit becomes quite unbearable. He came and sat down on things just when they were wanted to be packed. And he laboured under the fixed belief that whenever Harris or George reached out their hand for anything, it was his cold, damp nose they wanted. He put his leg into the jam, and he worried the teaspoons, and he pretended that the lemons were rats, and got into the hamper and killed 3 of them before Harris could land him with a frying pan. Harris said I encouraged him. I didn't encourage him. A dog like that don't want any encouragement. It's the natural, original sin that's born in him that makes him do things like that. The packing was done at 12:50, and Harris sat on the big hamper and said he hoped that nothing would be found broken. George said that if anything was broken, it was broken, which reflection seemed to comfort him. He also said that he was ready for bed. We were all ready for bed. Harris was to sleep with us that night, and we went upstairs. We tossed for bed, and Harris had to sleep with me. He said, "Do you prefer the inside or the outside, Jay?" I said I generally prefer to sleep inside a bed. And George said, "Oh, what time shall I wake you, fellows?" Harris said, 7. I said, "No, 6, because I wanted to write some letters." Harris and I had a bit of a row over it, but at last split the difference and said 6:30. "Wake us at 6:30, George," we said. George made no answer, and we found on going over that he'd been asleep for some time. So we placed the bath where he could tumble into it on getting out in the morning, and we went to bed ourselves. It was Mrs. Poppets that woke me next morning. She said, "Do you know that it's nearly 9 o'clock, sir?" "9 what?" I cried, starting up. 9 o'clock, she replied through the keyhole. "Thought you was oversleeping yourselves." I woke Harris and told him. He said, "But I thought you wanted to be up at 6. "So I did," I answered. "Well, why didn't you wake me?" he retorted. "Now we shan't be on the water till after 12. I wonder why you take the trouble to get up at all." I replied. "Lucky for you that I do. If I hadn't woken you, you'd have lain there for a whole fortnight." We snarled at one another in this strain for the next few minutes, when we were interrupted by a defiant snore from George, and it reminded us, for the first time since our being called, of his existence. There he lay, the man who wanted to know what time he should wake us, on his back, with his mouth wide open and his knees stuck up. I don't know why it should be, I'm sure, but the sight of another man asleep in bed when I am up maddens me. It seems to me so shocking to see the precious hours of a man's life, the priceless moments that will never come back to him again, being wasted in mere brutish sleep. There was George, throwing away in hideous sloth the inestimable gift of time, his valuable life, every second of which he'd have to account for hereafter, passing away from him unused. He might have been stuffing himself with eggs and bacon, irritating the dog, or flirting with a slavey, instead of sprawling there, sunk in soul-clogging oblivion. Oh, it was a terrible sight. Harris and I appeared to be struck by it at the same instant. We determined to save him, and in this noble resolve our own dispute was forgotten. We flew across and slung the clothes off him, and Harris landed in one with a slipper. And I shouted in his ear, and he woke.
"Oh, what's the matter?"
he observed, sitting up. "Get up, you fat-headed chunk!" roared Harris. "It's 10:15.
"Oh, what?"
he shrieked, jumping out of bed into the bath.
"Oh, who the thunder put this thing here?"
We told him he must have been a fool not to see the bath. We finished dressing, And when it came to the extras, we remembered that we had packed the toothbrushes and the brush and comb. Oh, that toothbrush of mine will be the death of me, I know. And we had to go downstairs and fish them out of the bag. And when we'd done that, George wanted the shaving tackle. Well, we told him he'd have to go without shaving that morning, as we were not going to unpack the bag again for him. He said, "Oh, don't be absurd. How can I go to the city like this?" Well, it was certainly rather tough on the city, but what cared we for human suffering? As Harris said in his common vulgar way, the city would have to lump it. We went downstairs to breakfast. Montmorency had invited 2 other dogs to come and see him off, and they were whiling away the time by fighting on the doorstep. Well, we calmed them with an umbrella and sat down to chops and cold beef. Harris said, "The great thing is to make a good breakfast." And he started with a couple of chops, saying he would take these while they were hot, as the beef could wait. George got hold of the paper and read us out loud the boating fatalities and the weather forecast, which latter prophesied rain, cold, wet to fine. Whatever more than usually ghastly thing in weather that may be. Occasional local thunderstorms, east wind, with general depression over the Midland counties, London and Channel, bar falling. It was too bright and sunny on this especial morning for his blood-curdling readings about bar falling to very much upset us, and so, finding that he could not make us wretched and was only wasting his time, he sneaked the cigarette that I had carefully rolled up for myself and went. Then Harris and I, having finished up the last few things left on the table, carted out the luggage onto the doorstep and waited for a cab. We got to Waterloo at 11 and asked where the 11.5 started from. Of course, nobody knew. Nobody at Waterloo ever does know where a train is going to start from, or where a train, when it does start, is going to, or anything about it. The porter, who took our things, thought it would go from number 2 platform, while another porter, with whom he discussed the question, had heard a rumour that it would go from number 1. The station master, on the other hand, was convinced it would start from the local. Well, to put an end to the matter, we went upstairs and asked the traffic superintendent, and he told us that he'd just met a man who said he'd seen it at number 3 platform. Well, we went to number 3 platform, but the authorities there said they rather thought that train was the Southampton Express, or else the Windsor Loop. But they were quite sure that it wasn't the Kingston train, though why they were sure they could not say. Then our porter said that it must be on the high-level platform, said he knew the train. So we went to the high-level platform and saw the engine driver and asked him if he was going to Kingston. He said he couldn't say for certain, of course, but that he rather thought that he was. Anyhow, if he wasn't the 11.5 for Kingston, he said he was pretty confident he was the 9:32 for Virginia Water, or the 10 a.m. express for the Isle of Wight, or somewhere in that direction, and we should all know when we got there. We slipped £0.50 into his hand and begged him to be the 11.5 for Kingston. "Nobody will ever know on this line," we said, "what you are or where you're going. You know the way. You slip off quietly and go to Kingston." "Well, I don't know, gents," replied the noble fellow, "but I suppose some train's got to go to Kingston, and I'll do it. Give me the £0.50. Thus we got to Kingston by the London and South Western Railway. We learned afterwards that the train we'd come by was really the Exeter Mail, and that they had spent hours at Waterloo looking for it, and no one knew what had become of it. Our boat was waiting for us at Kingston just below the bridge, and to it we wended our way, and round it we stored our luggage, and into it we stepped. "Are you all right, sir?" said the man. "Right it is," we answered, and with Harris at the sculls, and I at the tiller lines, and Montmorency, unhappy and deeply suspicious in the prow, out we shot onto the waters which, for a fortnight, were to be our home. Harris and I and Montmorency the dog set out on the first morning of our trip up the River Thames in a small boat. George was to join us later in the day. It was a glorious morning, late spring or early summer as you care to take it. The quaint back streets of Kingston, where they came down to the water's edge, looked quite picturesque in the flashing sunlight. The glinting river with its drifting barges, the wooden towpath, the trim-kept villas on the other side, Harris in a red and orange blazer grunting away at the sculls, the distant glimpses of the grey old palace of the Tudors, all made a sunny picture. So bright but calm, so full of life and yet so peaceful, that early in the day though it was, I felt myself being dreamily lulled off into a musing fit. I mused on Kingston, or Kiningastoon, as it was once called in the days when Saxon kings were crowned there. Great Caesar crossed the river there, and the Roman legions camped upon its sloping uplands. Caesar, like in later years Elizabeth, seems to have stopped everywhere, only he was more respectable than good old Queen Bess. He didn't put up at the public houses. She was nuts on public houses, was England's Virgin Queen. There's scarcely a pub of any attraction within 10 miles of London that she does not seem to have looked in at, or stopped at some time or other. I wonder now, supposing Harris, say, turned over a new leaf and became a great and good man and got to be Prime Minister and died, if they put up signs over the public houses that he had patronised. Harris had a glass of bitter in this house. Harris had 2 of Scotch cold here in the summer of '88. Harris was chucked from here in December 1886. No, there would be too many of them. It would be the houses that he had never entered that would become famous. Only house in South London that Harris never had a drink in. The people would flock to see it, to see what could have been the matter with it. At this point, Harris threw away the sculls, got up and left his seat, and sat on his back and stuck his legs in the air. Montmorency howled and turned a somersault, and the top hamper jumped up and all the things came out. I was somewhat surprised, but I did not lose my temper. I said, pleasantly enough, "Hello, what's that for?" "What's that for? Why—" No, on second thoughts, I will not repeat what Harris said. I may have been to blame, I admitted, but nothing excuses violence of language and coarseness of expression, especially in a man who's been carefully brought up, as I know Harris has been. I was thinking of other things, and forgot, as anyone might easily understand, that I was steering, and the consequence was that we'd got mixed up a good deal with the towpath. It was difficult to say for a moment which was us and which was the Middlesex bank of the river, but we found out after a while and separated ourselves. Harris, however, said that he'd done enough for a bit and proposed that I should take a turn. So, as we were in, I got out and took the tow line and ran the boat on past Hampton Court. Harris asked me if I'd ever been in the maze at Hampton Court. He said he went in once to show somebody else the way. He'd studied it up in a map, and it was so simple that it seemed foolish. It was a country cousin that Harris took in, and he said, "We'll just go in here that you can say you've been, but it's very simple. It's absurd to call it a maze. You just keep on taking the first turning to the right. We'll just walk around for 10 minutes and then go and get some lunch." They met some people soon after they got inside who said they had been there for 3/4 of an hour and had had about enough of it. Harris told them that they could follow him if they liked. He was just going in and then should turn round and come out again. They said it was very kind of him and fell behind and followed. They picked up various other people who wanted to get it over as they went along until they absorbed all the persons in the maze. People who'd given up all hope of ever getting either in or out, or ever seeing their homes and friends again, plucked up courage at the sight of Harris and his party and joined the procession, blessing him. Harris said he should judge there must have been 20 people following him in all, and one woman with a baby, who had been there all morning, insisted on taking his arm for fear of losing him. Harris kept on, turning to the right, but it seemed a long way, and his cousin said he supposed it was a very big maze. "One of the largest in Europe," said Harris. "Yes, it must be," replied the cousin, "because we've walked a good 2 miles already." Harris began to think it rather strange himself, but he held on until at last they passed the half a bun on the ground that Harris's cousin swore he'd noticed there 7 minutes ago. Harris said, "Oh, impossible!" But the woman with the baby said, "Not at all," as she herself had taken it from the child and thrown it down there just before she'd met Harris. And she also added that she wished she'd never met Harris and expressed an opinion that he was an impostor. Well, that made Harris mad, and he produced his map and explained his theory. "That map'll be right enough," said one of the party, "if you know whereabouts we are now." Harris didn't know, and suggested that the best thing to do would be to go back to the entrance and begin again. For the beginning again part of it, there was not much enthusiasm, but with regard to the advisability of going back to the entrance, there was complete unanimity. So they turned and trailed after Harris again in the opposite direction, and about 10 minutes more passed, and they found themselves in the centre. Harris thought at first of pretending that that was what he was aiming at, but the crowd looked dangerous, and he decided to treat it as an accident. Anyhow, they had got something to start from then. They did know where they were, and the map was once more consulted. And the thing seemed simpler than ever, and off they started for the third time. And 3 minutes later, they were back in the centre again. After that, they simply couldn't get anywhere else. Whatever way they turned brought them back to the middle. It became so regular at length that some of the people stopped there and waited for the others to take a walk around and come back to them. Harris drew out his map again after a while, but the sight of it only infuriated the mob, and they told him to go and curl his hair with it. Harris said that he couldn't help feeling that, to a certain extent, he had become unpopular. They all got crazy at last and sang out for the keeper, and the man came and climbed up the ladder outside and shouted out directions to them. But all their heads were, by this time, in such a confused whirl that they were incapable of grasping anything, and so the man told them to stop where they were, and he would come to them. They huddled together and waited, and he climbed down and came in. He was a young keeper, as luck would have it, and new to the business. And when he got in, he couldn't get to them, and then he got lost. They caught sight of him every now and then, rushing about the other side of the hedge, and he would see them and rush to get them, and they'd wait there for about 5 minutes, and then he'd reappear again in exactly the same spot, and then ask them where they had been. They had to wait until one of the old keepers came back from his dinner before they got out. Harris said he thought it was a very fine maze, so far as he was a judge, and we agreed that we would try to get George to go into it. It was while passing through Molesey Lock that Harris told me about his maze experience. It took us some time to pass through, as we were the only boat, and it's a big lock. I don't think I ever remember to have seen Molesey Lock before with only one boat in it. It is, I suppose, bolters not even excepted, the busiest lock on the river. I've stood and watched it sometimes when you could not see any water at all, but only a brilliant tangle of bright blazers and gay caps and saucy hats and many-coloured parasols and silken rugs and cloaks and streaming ribbons and dainty whites. When looking down into the lock from the quay, you might fancy it was a huge box into which flowers of every hue and shade had been thrown pell-mell and lay piled up in a rainbow heap that covered every corner. On a fine Sunday, it presents this appearance nearly all day long, while upstream and down the stream lie, waiting their turn outside the gates, long lines of still more boats. And boats are drawing near and still passing away, so that the sunny river, from the palace up to Hampton Church, is dotted and decked with yellow and blue and orange and white and red and pink. All the inhabitants of Hampton and Molesey dress themselves up in boating costume and come and mooch around the lock with their dogs and flirt and smoke and watch the boats, and all together, what with the caps and jackets of the men and the pretty-coloured dresses of the women, the excited dogs, the moving boats, the white sails, the pleasant landscape, and the sparkling water, it's one of the gayest sights that I know of near this dull old London town. The river affords a good opportunity for dress. For once in a way, we men are able to show our taste in colours, and I think we come out pretty natty, if you ask me. I always like a little red in my things, red and black. You know, my hair is a sort of golden brown, rather a pretty shade, I've been told, and a dark red matches it beautifully. And then I always think a light blue necktie goes well with it, and a pair of those Russian leather shoes and a red silk handkerchief round the waist. Yes, a handkerchief looks so much better than a belt. Harris always keeps to shades or mixtures of orange or yellow, but I don't think he's at all wise in this. His complexion is too dark for yellows. Yellows don't suit him. There can be no question about it. It's a great pity, because he'll never be a success as it is. Now, there are one or two colours in which he might not really look so bad, with his hat on. George has brought some new things for his trip, and I'm rather vexed about them. The blazer is loud. I should not like George to know that I thought so, but there really is no other word for it. He brought it home and showed it to us on Thursday evening. We asked him what colour he called it, and he said he didn't know. He didn't think there was a name for the colour. The man told him it was an Oriental design. Well, George put it on and asked us what we thought of it. Harris said that as an object to hang over a flower bed in early spring to frighten the birds away, he should respect it, but that, considered as an article of dress for a human being, it made him ill. George got quite huffy, but Harris said if he didn't want his opinion, then why ask for it? Harris wanted to get out at Hampton Church to go and see Mrs. Thomas's tomb. Who's Mrs. Thomas? I asked. Well, how should I know? Replied Harris. She's a lady that's got a funny tomb, and I want to see it. I objected. I don't know whether it's that I'm built wrong, but I never did seem to hanker after tombstones myself. I know that the proper thing to do when you get to a village or town is to rush off to the churchyard and enjoy the graves, but it's a recreation that I always deny myself. I've no interest in creeping round dim and chilly churches behind wheezy old men and reading epitaphs. I shock respectable old sextons by the imperturbability that I'm able to assume before exciting inscriptions, and by my lack of enthusiasm for the local family history, while my ill-concealed anxiety to get outside wounds their feelings. One golden morning of a sunny day, I leant against the low stone wall that guarded a little village church, and I smoked and drank in deep, calm gladness from the sweet, restful scene. The old grey church with its clustering ivy and its quaint carved wooden porch, the white lane winding down the hill between tall rows of elms, the thatched-roofed cottages peeping above their trim-kept hedges, the silver river in the hollow, the wooded hills beyond. It was a lovely landscape. It was idyllic, poetical, and it inspired me. I felt good and noble. I felt I didn't want to be sinful and wicked any more. I'd come and live here and never do any more wrong, and lead a blameless, beautiful life, and have silver hair when I got old, and all that sort of thing. In that moment, I forgave all my friends and relations for their wickedness and cussedness, and I blessed them. They didn't know that I blessed them. They went their abandoned way, all unconscious of what I, far away in that peaceful village, was doing for them. But I did it, and I wished that I could let them know that I'd done it, because I wanted to make them happy. Well, I was going on, thinking away all these grand, tender thoughts, when my reverie was broken in upon by a shrill, piping voice crying out, "Oh, all right, sir, I'm a-comin'. I'm a-comin'. It's all right, sir. Don't you be in a hurry." I looked up and saw an old, bald-headed man hobbling across the churchyard towards me, carrying a huge bunch of keys in his hand that shook and jingled at every step. I motioned him away with silent dignity, but he still advanced, screeching out the while, "I'm a-comin', sir. I'm a-comin'. I'm a little lame. I ain't as spry as I used to be. This way, sir." "Go away, you miserable old man," I said. "Oh, I've come as soon as I could, sir," he replied. "My missus never see you till just this minute. Now you follow me, sir." "Go away," I repeated. "Leave me before I get over the wall and slay you." He seemed surprised. "Don't you want to see the tombs?" he said. "No," I answered, "I don't. I want to stop here, leaning up against this gritty old wall. Go away and don't disturb me. I am chock full of beautiful and noble thoughts, and I want to stop like it, because it feels nice and good. Now don't you come fooling about, making me mad, chivying away all my better feelings with this silly tombstone nonsense of yours. Go away and get somebody to bury you cheap, and I'll pay half the expense." He was bewildered for a moment. He rubbed his eyes and looked hard at me. I seemed human enough on the outside, but he couldn't make it out. He said, "You's a stranger in these parts. You don't live here?" "No," I said, "I don't. You wouldn't if I did." "Well, then," he said, "you want to see the tombs, graves. Folks been buried, you know. Coffins." "You are an untruther," I replied, getting roused. "I do not want to see tombs, not your tombs. Why should I? We have graves of our own, our family has. Why, my Uncle Podger has a tomb in Kensal Green Cemetery that's the pride of all that countryside, and my grandfather's vault at Bow is capable of accommodating 8 visitors, while my great-aunt Susan has a brick grave in Finchley Churchyard with a headstone with a coffee-pot sort of thing in bas-relief upon it, and a 6-inch best white stone coping all the way round that cost pounds. When I want graves, it is those places that I shall go and revel. I do not want other folks. When you yourself are buried, I will come and see yours. That is all I can do for you." He burst into tears. He said that one of the tombs had a bit of stone upon the top of it that had been said by some to be probably part of the remains of the figure of a man, and that another had some words carved upon it that nobody had ever been able to decipher. I still remained obdurate, and in broken-hearted tones he said,
Well, won't you come and see the memorial window?
I would not even see that. So he fired his last shot. He drew near and whispered hoarsely, "Oh, you've got a couple of skulls down in the crypt," he said. "Come and see those. Oh, do come and see the skulls. You're a young man out for an holiday, and you want to enjoy yourself. Come and see the skulls." Then I turned and fled. And as I sped, I heard him calling to me, "Oh, come and see the skulls! Come back and see the skulls!" Harris, however, revels in tombs and graves and epitaphs and monumental inscriptions, and the thought of not seeing Mrs. Thomas's grave made him crazy. He said he'd looked forward to seeing Mrs. Thomas's grave from the very first moment that the trip was proposed. Said he wouldn't have joined if it hadn't been for the idea of seeing Mrs. Thomas's tomb. I reminded him of George, and how we had to get the boat up to Shepperton by 5 o'clock to meet him, and then he went for George. Why was George to fool about all day and leave us to lug this lumbering old top-heavy barge up and down the river by ourselves to meet him? Why couldn't George come and do some work? Why couldn't he have the day off and come down with us? Bank be blowed. What good was he at the bank? "I never see him doing any work there," continued Harris. "Whenever I go in, he sits behind a bit of glass all day, trying to look as if he was doing something. What's the good of a man behind a bit of glass? I have to work for my living. Why can't he work? What use is he there? And what's the good of their banks? They take your money, and then, when you draw a cheque, they send it back, smeared all over with no effects, refer to drawer. What's the good of that? That's the sort of trick they served me twice last week. No, I'm not going to stand it much longer. I shall withdraw my account. If he was here, we could go and see the tomb. I don't believe he's at the bank at all. He's larking about somewhere. That's what he's doing, leaving us to do all the work. I'm going to get out and have a drink." I pointed out to him that we were miles away from a pub, and then he went on about the river. And what was the good of the river? And was everyone who came on the river to die of thirst? It is always best to let Harris have his head when he gets like this. Then he pumps himself out and is quiet afterwards. I reminded him that there was concentrated lemonade in the hamper and a gallon jar of water in the nose of the boat, and that the two only wanted mixing to make a cool and refreshing beverage. Then he flew off about lemonade and such like Sunday school slops, as he termed them, ginger beer, raspberry syrup, etc., etc. He said they all produced dyspepsia and ruined body and soul alike, and were the cause of half the crime in England. Said he must drink something, however, and climbed upon the seat and leant over to get the bottle. It was right at the bottom of the hamper and seemed difficult to find, and he had to lean over farther and farther, and in trying to steer at the same time from a topsy-turvy point of view, he pulled the wrong line and sent the boat into the bank. And the shock upset him, and he dived right down into the hamper and stood there on his head, holding onto the side of the boat like grim death, his legs sticking up into the air. He dared not move for fear of going over, and had to stay there till I could get hold of his legs and haul him back, and that made him madder than ever. We stopped under the willows by Kempton Park and lunched. It's a pretty little spot there, a pleasant grass plateau running along by the water's edge and overhung by willows. After lunch, we sculled up to Weybridge, where the Wey, the Bourne, and the Basingstoke Canal all enter the Thames together. The lock is just opposite the town, and the first thing that we saw when we came in view of it was George's blazer on one of the lock gates, and closer inspection showed us that George was inside it. Montmorency set up a furious barking. I shrieked, Harris roared, George waved his hat and yelled back. The lockkeeper rushed out with his drag, under the impression that somebody had fallen into the lock, and appeared annoyed at finding that nobody had. George had a rather curious oilskin-covered parcel in his hand. It was round and flat at one end, with a long straight handle sticking out of it. "Oh, what's that?" said Harris. "A frying pan?" "No," said George, with a strange, wild look glittering in his eyes. "They're all the rage this season. Everybody's got one up the river. Yes, it's a banjo." "I never knew you played the banjo," cried Harris and I in one breath. "Not exactly," replied George, "but it's very easy, they tell me, and I've got the instruction book." We made George work, now we'd got him. He didn't want to work, of course, that goes without saying. He'd had a hard time in the city, so he explained, and Harris, who is callous in his nature and not prone to pity, said, Now you're going to have a hard time on the river for a change. Change is good for everyone. Out you get. He couldn't in all conscience, not even George's conscience, object, though he did suggest that perhaps it would be better for him to stop in the boat and get tea ready while Harris and I towed, because getting tea was such a worrying work, and Harris and I looked tired. The only reply we made to this, however, was to pass him over the tow line, and he took it and stepped out. There's something very strange and unaccountable about a tow line. You roll it up with as much patience and care as you would take to fold up a new pair of trousers, and 5 minutes afterwards, when you pick it up, it is one ghastly, soul-revolting tangle. Now, this tow line I had taken in myself just before we got to the lock. I would not let Harris touch it because he's careless. I had looped it round slowly and cautiously, and tied it up in the middle, and folded it in two, and laid it down gently at the bottom of the boat. Harris had lifted it up scientifically and had put it into George's hand. George had taken it firmly and held it away from him, and had begun to unravel it as if he was taking the swaddling clothes off a new-born infant, and before he had unwound a dozen yards, the thing was more like a badly made doormat than anything else. It's always the same. And the same sort of thing always goes on in connection with it. The man on the bank who is trying to disentangle it thinks all the fault lies with the man who rolled it up. And when a man up the river thinks a thing, he says it. What have you been trying to do with it? Make a fishing net out of it? You made a nice mess, you have. Why couldn't you wind it up properly, you silly dummy? He grunts from time to time as he struggles wildly with it and lays it out flat on the towpath and runs round and round it, trying to find an end. On the other hand, the man who wound it up thinks the whole cause of the muddle rests with the man who's trying to unwind it. It was all right when you took it, he exclaims indignantly. Why don't you think what you're doing? And they feel so angry with each other, they'd like to hang each other with the thing. Well, 10 minutes go by, and the first man gives a yell and goes mad, and dances on the rope, and tries to pull it straight by seizing hold of the first piece that comes to his hand and hauling at it. Of course, this only gets it into a tighter tangle than ever. Then the second man climbs out of the boat and comes to help him, and they get into each other's way and hinder each other. They both get hold of the same piece of line and pull at it in opposite directions and wonder when it's caught. And in the end, they do get it clear. Then they turn round and find the boat has drifted off and is making straight for the weir. One sees a good many funny incidents up the river in connection with towing. One of the most common is the sight of a couple of towers walking briskly along deep in an animated discussion, while the man on the boat, 100 yards behind them, is vainly shrieking at them to stop and making frantic signs of distress with an oar. Something has gone wrong. The rudder's come off, or the boat hook has slipped overboard, or his hat has dropped into the water and is floating rapidly downstream. He calls to them to stop, quite gently and politely at first. Hi! Stop a minute, will you? He shouts cheerily. I've dropped my hat overboard. Then, hi, Tom, Dick, can't you hear? Not quite so affably this time. And then, hi, confound you, you dunder-headed idiots! Hi! Stop! Oh, you... After that, he springs up and dances about and roars himself red in the face and curses everything he knows. And the small boys on the bank stop and jeer at him and pitch stones at him as he is pulled past them at the rate of 4 miles an hour, and he can't get out. Much of this sort of trouble would be saved if those who are towing would keep remembering that they're towing and give a pretty frequent look around to see how their man is getting on. It's best to let one person tow, for when two are towing it, they get chattering and forget, and the boat itself, offering, as it does, but little resistance, is of no real service in reminding them of the fact. As an example of how utterly oblivious a pair of towers can be to their work, George told us later on in the evening, when we were discussing the subject over supper, of a very curious instance. He and 3 other men, he said, were sculling a very heavily laden boat up from Maidenhead one evening, and a little above Cookham Lock they noticed a fellow and a girl walking along the towpath, both deep in an apparently interesting and absorbing conversation. They were carrying a boat hook between them, and attached to the boat hook was a tow line, which trailed behind them, its end in the water. No boat was near, no boat was in sight. There must have been a boat attached to that tow line at some time or other, that was certain, but what had become of it? What ghastly fate had overtaken it and those who'd been left in it was buried in mystery. Whatever the accident may have been, however, it had in no way disturbed the young lady and gentleman who were towing. They had the boat hook, and they had the line. but that seemed to be all that they thought necessary for their work. George was about to call out and wake them up, but at that moment a bright idea flashed across him. And he didn't. He got the hitchard instead and reached over and drew in the end of the tow line, and they made a loop of it and put it over their mast, and then they tidied up the sculls and went and sat down in the stern and lit their pipes. And that young man and young woman towed those 4 hulking chaps in a heavy boat up to Marlow. George said he never saw so much thoughtful sadness concentrated into one glance before as when, at the lock, that young couple grasped the idea that for the last 2 miles they'd been towing the wrong boat. George fancied that if it had not been for the restraining influence of the sweet woman at his side, the young man might have given way to violent language. The maiden was the first to recover her surprise, and when she did, she clasped her hands and said wildly, "Oh, Henry, then where is Auntie?" "Did they ever recover the old lady?" asked Harris. George replied that he did not know. George towed us steadily on to Penton Hook. There we discussed the important question of camping. We had decided to sleep on board that night, and we had either to lay up just about there or go on past Staines. Well, it seemed early to think about shutting up then, however, with the sun still in the heavens, and we settled to push straight on for Runnymede, 3.5 miles farther, a quiet, wooded part of the river, and where there is good shelter. We all wished, however, afterwards that we had stopped at Penton Hook. 3 or 4 miles upstream is a trifle early in the morning, but it is a weary pull at the end of a long day. You take no interest in the scenery during these last few miles. You do not chat and laugh. Every half mile you cover seems like 2. You can hardly believe that you're only where you are, and you're convinced that the map must be wrong. And when you have trudged along for what seems to you at least 10 miles, and still the lock is not in sight, you begin to seriously fear that somebody must have sneaked it and run off with it. I remember once, I was on the river with a young lady, a cousin on my mother's side, and we were pulling down to Goring. It was rather late, and we were anxious to get in. At least, she was anxious to get in. It was 6:30 when we reached Benson's Lock, and dusk was drawing on, and she began to get excited then. She said she must be into supper, and I said it was a thing I felt I wanted to be in at too, and I drew out a map I had with me to see exactly how far it was. I saw it was just 1.5 miles to the next lock, Wallingford, and 5 on from there to Cleeve. "Oh, it's all right," I said. "We'll be through the next lock before 7, and then there's only 1 more." And I settled down and pulled steadily away. We passed the bridge, and soon after that I asked if she saw the lock. She said no, she did not see any lock, and I said, "Oh," and pulled on. Another 5 minutes went by, and then I asked her to look again. "No," she said, "I can't see any sign of a lock." You are sure you know a lock when you do see one?" I asked hesitatingly, not wishing to offend her. The question did not offend her, however, and she suggested that I had better look for myself. So I laid down the sculls and took a view. The river stretched out straight before us in the twilight for about 1 mile. Not a ghost of a lock was to be seen. "You don't think we've lost our way, do you?" asked my companion. Well, I did not see how that was possible, though, as I suggested, we might have somehow got into the Weir stream and been making for the falls. Well, this idea did not comfort her in the least, and she began to cry. She said we should both be drowned, and that it was a judgment on her for coming out with me. Well, it seemed an excessive punishment, I thought, but my cousin thought not, and hoped it would soon all be over. I tried to reassure her, and to make light of the whole affair. I said that the fact evidently was that I was not rowing as fast as I fancied I was, but that we should soon reach the lock now, and I pulled on for another mile. And then I began to get nervous myself. I looked again at the map. There was Wallingford Lock, clearly marked, 1.5 miles below Benson's. It was a good, reliable map, and besides, I recollected the lock myself. I had been through it twice. Where were we? What had happened to us? Well, I began to think it must all be a dream, and that I was really asleep in bed, and should wake up in a minute and be told it was past 10. I still went on pulling, however, and still no lock came in sight. And the river grew more and more gloomy and mysterious under the gathering shadows of night, and things seemed to be getting weird and uncanny. I thought of hobgoblins and banshees and will-o'-the-wisps and those wicked girls who sit up all night on rocks and lure people into whirlpools and things. And, I wished I'd been a better man and knew more hymns. And in the middle of these reflections, I heard the blessed strains of a concertina and knew that we were saved. The sweet sounds drew nearer, and soon the boat from which they were worked came alongside us. It contained a party of provincial Aries and Ariots out for a moonlight sail. There was not any moon, but that was not their fault. I never saw more attractive, lovable people in all my life. I hailed them and asked them if they could tell me the way to Wallingford Lock, and I explained that I'd been looking for it for the last 2 hours.
Wallingford Lock? They answered. Lord love you, sir. That's been done away with for over a year. Oh, there ain't no Wallingford Lock now, sir. No, you're close to Cleve now. Blow me tight if here ain't a gentleman been looking for Wallingford Lock, Bill.
I never thought of that. I wanted to fall upon their necks and bless them, but the stream was running too strong just there to allow of this, so I had to content myself with mere cold-sounding words of gratitude. We thanked them over and over again, and we said it was a lovely night, and we wished them a pleasant trip, and I think I invited them all to come and spend the week with me, and my cousin said her mother would be so pleased to see them, and we sang the Soldier's Chorus out of Faust and got home in time for supper after all. Harris and I began to think that Bell Weir Lock must have been done away with after the same manner. George had towed us up to Staines, and we had taken the boat from there, and it seemed that we were dragging 50 tons after us, and were walking 40 miles. It was 7:30 when we were through, and we all got in and sculled up close to the left bank, looking out for a spot to haul up in. We had originally intended to go on to Magna Charta Island, a sweetly pretty part of the river where it winds through a soft green valley, and to camp in one of the many picturesque inlets to be found round that tiny shore. But somehow we didn't feel that we yearned for the picturesque nearly so much as we had earlier in the day. A bit of water between a coal barge and a gasworks would have quite satisfied us for that night. We didn't want scenery. We wanted to have our supper and to go to bed. However, we did pull up to the point, a picnic point it's called, and dropped into the very pleasant nook under a great elm tree, to the spreading roots of which we fastened the boat. Then we thought we were going to have supper. We had dispensed with tea so as to save time, but George said no, that we'd better get the canvas up first before it got quite dark, and while we could still see what we were doing. And then he said all our work would be done, and we could sit down to eat with an easy mind. Well, that canvas wanted more putting up than I think any of us had bargained for. It looked so simple in the abstract. You took 5 iron arches, like gigantic croquet hoops, and fitted them up over the boat, and then stretched the canvas over them and fastened it down. It would take quite 10 minutes, we thought. That was an underestimate. We took up the hoops and began to drop them into the sockets placed for them. Now, you wouldn't imagine this to be a dangerous work, but looking back now, the wonder to me is that any of us are still alive to tell the tale. They were not hoops, they were demons. First, they wouldn't fit into their sockets at all, and then we had to jump on them and kick them and hammer at them with the boat hook. And when they were in, it turned out that they were the wrong hoops for those particular sockets, and they had to come out again. But they would not come out, until 2 of us had gone and struggled with them for 5 minutes, when they would jump up suddenly and try and throw us into the water and drown us. They had hinges in the middle, and when we weren't looking, they nipped us with these hinges in delicate parts of the body. And while we were wrestling with one side of the hoop and endeavouring to persuade it to do its duty, the other side would come up behind us in a cowardly manner and hit us over the head. We got them fixed at last, and then all that was to be done was to arrange for covering over them. Now, George unrolled it and fastened one end over the nose of the boat, and Harris stood in the middle to take it from George and roll it on to me, and I kept by the stern to receive it. It was a long time coming down to me. George did his part all right, but it was new work to Harris, and he bungled it. How he managed it, I do not know. He couldn't explain it himself, but by some mysterious process or other, he succeeded, after 10 minutes of superhuman effort, in getting himself completely rolled up in it. He was so firmly wrapped around and tucked in and folded over that he couldn't get out. He, of course, made frantic struggles for freedom, the birthright of every Englishman, and in doing so, I learned this afterwards, knocked over George, and then George, swearing at Harris, began to struggle too and got himself entangled and rolled up. Now, I knew nothing about all this at the time. I didn't understand the business at all myself. You see, I'd been told to stand where I was and wait till the canvas came to me. And Montmorency and I stood there and waited, both as good as gold. We could see the canvas being violently jerked and tossed about pretty considerably, but we supposed this was part of the method and did not interfere. We also heard much smothered language coming from the underneath of it, and we guessed that they were finding the job rather troublesome and concluded that we would wait until things had got a little simpler before we joined in. We waited some time, but matters seemed to get only more and more involved until at last George's head came wriggling out over the side of the boat and spoke up. It said, "Give us a hand here, can't you, you cuckoo, standing there like a stuffed mummy when you see that we're both being suffocated, you dummy." I could never withstand an appeal for help, so I went and undid them. Not before it was time, either, for Harris was nearly black in the face. It took us half an hour's hard labour after that before it was properly up, and then we cleared the decks and got out supper. We put the kettle on to boil up in the nose of the boat and went down to the stern and pretended to take no notice of it, but set to work in getting other things out. You see, that's the only way to get a kettle to boil up the river. If it sees that you're waiting for it and are anxious, it'll never even sing. No, you have to go away and begin your meal as if you were not going to have any tea at all. You must not even look round at it. Then you'll soon hear it spluttering away, mad to be made into tea. It's a good plan, too, if you're in a great hurry, to talk very loudly to each other about how you don't need any tea and you're not going to have any. You get near the kettle so that it can overhear you, and then you shout out, "I don't want any tea, do you, George?" To which George shouts back, "Oh, no, I don't like tea, no. We'll have lemonade instead. Tea is so indigestible." Upon which the kettle boils over and puts the stove out. We adopted this harmless bit of trickery, and the result was that by the time everything else was ready, the tea was waiting. Then we lit the lantern and squatted down to supper. Oh, we wanted that supper. For 35 minutes, not a sound was heard throughout the length and breadth of that boat, save the clank of cutlery and crockery and the steady grinding of our 4 sets of molars. At the end of 35 minutes, Harris said, "Ah," and took his left leg out from under him and put his right one there instead. And 5 minutes afterwards, George said, "Ah," too, and threw his plate out on the bank, and 3 minutes later than that, Montmorency gave the first sign of contentment he'd exhibited since we'd started, and rolled over on his side and spread his legs out. And then I said, "Ah," and bent my head back, and bumped it against one of the hoops, but I didn't mind it. No, I didn't even swear. Before our supper, Harris and George and I were quarrelsome and snappy and ill-tempered. After our supper, we sat and beamed on one another, and we beamed upon the dog, too. We loved each other. We loved everybody. Harris, in moving about, trod on George's corn. Had this happened before supper, George would have expressed wishes and desires concerning Harris's fate in this world and the next that would have made a thoughtful man shudder. As it was, he said, "Steady, old man, we're wheat." And Harris, instead of merely observing in his most unpleasant tones that a fellow could hardly help treading on some bit of George's foot if he had to walk about at all within 10 yards of where George was sitting, suggesting that George never ought to come into an ordinary-sized boat with feet that length and advising him to hang them over the side, as he would have done before supper, now said, "Oh, I'm sorry, old chap. I hope I haven't hurt you." And George said, "Oh, not at all," that it was his fault, and Harry said, "No, it was his." It was quite pretty to hear them. We lit our pipes and sat looking out on the quiet night and talked. George said, why could not we always be like this, away from the world with its sins and temptations, leading sober, peaceful lives and doing good? I said, it was the sort of thing that I'd often longed for myself, and we discussed the possibility of our going away, we 4, to some handy, well-fitted desert island and living there in the woods. Harry said that the danger about desert islands, as far as he had heard, was that they were so damp. But George said, no, not if properly drained. And then we got on to drains, and that put George in mind of a very funny thing that happened to his father once. He said his father was travelling with another fellow through Wales, and one night they stopped at a little inn, where there were some other fellows, and they joined these other fellows and spent the evening with them. They had a very jolly evening and sat up late, and by the time they came to bed, this was when George's father was a very young man, were slightly jolly too. They, George's father and George's father's friend, were to sleep in the same room, but in different beds. They took the candle and went up. The candle lurched up against the wall when they got into the room and went out, and they had to undress and grope into bed in the dark. This they did, but instead of getting into separate beds, as they thought they were doing, they both climbed into the same one without knowing it. One getting in with his head at the top, and the other crawling in from the opposite side of the compass and lying with his feet on the pillow. There was silence for a moment, and then George's father said,
Joe? What's the matter, Tom?
replied Joe's voice from the other end of the bed.
Why, there's a man in my bed,
said George's father.
He has his feet on my pillow.
Well, that's an extraordinary thing, Tom,
answered the other.
But I'm blessed if there isn't a man in my bed, too.
What are you going to do?
asked George's father.
Well, I'm going to chuck him out,
replied Joe.
So am I,
said George's father, valiantly. There was a brief struggle, followed by 2 heavy bumps on the floor, and then a rather doleful voice said,
I say, Tom.
Yes?
How have you got on?
Well, to tell you the truth, my man's chucked me out.
So's mine. I say, I don't think much of this in, do you?
We turned in at 10 that night, and I thought I should sleep well, being tired, but I didn't. As a rule, I undress and put my head on the pillow, and then somebody bangs at the door and says it's 8:30. But tonight, everything seemed against me. The novelty of it all, the hardness of the boat, the cramped position. I was lying with my feet under one seat and my head on another. The sound of the lapping water round the boat and the wind among the branches kept me restless and disturbed. I did get to sleep for a few hours, and then some part of the boat, which seemed to have grown up in the night, for it certainly wasn't there when we started, and it disappeared by the morning, kept digging into my spine. I slept through it for a while, dreaming that I'd swallowed a sovereign, and that they were cutting a hole in my back with a gimlet, so as to try and get it out. I thought it very unkind of them, and I told them that I would owe them the money, and they should have it by the end of the month. But they wouldn't hear of that, and said it would be much better if interest would accumulate so. Well, I got quite cross with them after a bit and told them what I thought of them, and then they gave the gimlet such an excruciating wrench that I woke up. Well, I must have dozed off again until I woke at 6 the next morning, and found George awake too. We both turned round and tried to go to sleep again, but we could not. Had there been any particular reason why we should not have gone to sleep again, but have got up and dressed there and then, we should have dropped off while we were looking at our watches and have slept till 10. As there was no earthly necessity for our getting up under another 2 hours at the very least, and our getting up at that time was an utter absurdity, it was only in keeping with the natural cussedness of things in general that we should both feel that lying down for 5 minutes more would be death to us. So I set to work to wake up Harris. The third prod did it, and he turned over on the other side and said,
He would be down in a minute, and that he would have his lace-up boots.
We soon let him know where he was, however, by the aid of the hitcher. And he sat up suddenly, sending Montmorency, who'd been sleeping the sleep of the just, right in the middle of his chest, sprawling across the boat. Then we pulled up the canvas, and all 4 of us poked our head out over the offside and looked down at the water and shivered. The idea, overnight, had been that we should get up early in the morning, fling off our rugs and shawls, and throwing back the canvas, spring into the river with a joyous shout, and revel in a long, delicious swim. But somehow, now the morning had come, the notion seemed less tempting. The water looked damp and chilly. The wind felt cold. "Well, who's going to be first in?" said Harris at last. There was no rush for precedence. George settled the matter so far as he was concerned by retiring into the boat and putting on his socks. Montmorency gave vent to an involuntary howl, as if merely thinking of the thing had given him the horrors, and Harris said it'd be so difficult to get into the boat again, and went back and sorted out his trousers. I did not altogether like to give in, though I didn't relish the plunge. I meant to compromise matters by going down to the edge and just throwing the water over myself. So I took a towel and crept out on the bank and wormed my way along on the branch of a tree that dipped down into the water. Ooh, it was bitterly cold. The wind cut like a knife. I thought I would not throw the water over myself at all. No, I would go back into the boat and dress. So I turned to do so. And as I turned, the silly branch gave way, and I and the towel went in together with a tremendous splash. "By Jove, old Jay's gone in," I heard Harry say as I came blowing to the surface. "But I didn't think I had the pluck to do it." "Is it all right?" sang out George. "Lovely," I spluttered back. "You are duffers not to come in. I wouldn't have missed this for worlds. Why don't you try it? It only wants a little determination." But I could not persuade them. Rather an amusing thing happened while dressing that morning. I was very cold when I got back into the boat, and in my hurry to get my shirt on, I accidentally jerked it into the water. It made me awfully wild, especially as George burst out laughing. But I couldn't see anything to laugh at, and I told George so, and he only laughed the more. I never saw a man laugh so much. I quite lost my temper with him at last, and I pointed out to him what a drivelling maniac of an imbecile idiot he was. But he only roared the louder. And then, just as I was landing the shirt, I noticed that it was not my shirt at all, but George's, which I had mistaken for mine. Whereupon the humour of the thing struck me for the first time, and I began to laugh. And the more I looked from George's wet shirt to George, roaring with laughter, the more I was amused. And I laughed so much that I had to let the shirt fall back into the water again. "Ain't you going to get it out?" said George. I couldn't answer him at all for a while. I was laughing so. But at last, between my peels, I managed to jerk out, "It isn't my shirt. It's yours." I never saw a man's face change from lively to severe so suddenly in all my life before. "What?" he yelled, springing up. You silly cuckoo! Why can't you be more careful what you're doing? Why the deuce don't you go and dress on the bank? You're not fit to be in a boat, you're not. Oh, give me the hitcher." I tried to make him see the fun of the thing, but he could not. George is very dense at seeing a joke sometimes. Alice proposed that we should have scrambled eggs for breakfast. He said that he would cook them. Well, it seemed from his account that he was very good at doing scrambled eggs. He often did them at picnics and went out on yachts. He was quite famous for them. People who had once tasted his scrambled eggs, so we gathered from his conversation, never cared for any other food afterwards, but pined away and died when they could not get them. It made our mouths water to hear him talk about the things, and we handed him the stove and the frying pan and all the eggs that had not got smashed and gone over everything in the hamper, and begged him to begin. Well, he had some trouble in breaking the eggs, or rather not so much trouble in breaking them exactly, as in getting them into the frying pan when broken, and keeping them off his trousers and preventing them from running up his sleeve. But he fixed some half-dozen into the pan at last, and then squatted down by the side of the stove and chivied them about with a fork. The result was not altogether the success that Harris had anticipated. There seemed so little to show for the business. 6 eggs had gone into the frying pan, and all that came out was a teaspoonful of burnt and unappetizing-looking mess. The sun had got more powerful by the time that we'd finished breakfast, and the wind had dropped, and it was as lovely a morning as one could desire. Little was in sight to remind us of the 19th century, and as we looked out upon the river in the morning sunlight, we could almost fancy that the centuries between us and that ever-to-be famous June morning of 1215 had been drawn aside, and the wee English yeoman sons in homespun cloth with dirk at belt were waiting there to witness the writing of the Magna Charta. That stupendous page in history. I was sitting on the bank, conjuring up this scene to myself, when George remarked that when I was quite rested, perhaps I wouldn't mind helping to wash up, and thus recalled from the days of the glorious past to the prosaic present, with all its misery and sin, I slid down into the boat and cleaned out the frying pan with a stick of wood and a tuft of grass, polishing it up finally with George's wet shirt. After you pass Old Windsor, the river is somewhat uninteresting and doesn't become itself again until you are nearing Boveney. So we tugged steadily on to a little below Monkey Island, where we drew up and lunched. We tackled the cold beef for lunch, and then we found that we had forgotten to bring any mustard. I don't think I ever in my life, before or since, felt I wanted mustard as badly as I felt I wanted it then. I don't care for mustard as a rule. and it's very seldom that I take it at all, but I would have given whole worlds for it then. Harris said he would have given worlds for mustard too. It would have been a good thing for anybody who had come up to that spot with a can of mustard then. He'd have been set up in worlds for the rest of his life. It cast gloom over the boat, there being no mustard. We ate our beef in silence. Existence seemed hollow and uninteresting. We thought of the happy days of childhood and sighed. We brightened up a bit, however, over the apple tart, and when George drew out a tin of pineapple from the bottom of the hamper and rolled it into the middle of the boat, we felt that life was worth living after all. We were very fond of pineapple, all three of us. We looked at the picture on the tin. We thought of the juice. We smiled at one another, and Harris got a spoon ready. Then we looked for the knife to open the tin with. We turned out everything in the hamper. We turned out the bags, we pulled up the boards at the bottom of the boat, we took everything out on the bank and shook it. There was no tin opener to be found. Then Harris tried to open the tin with a pocket knife and broke the knife and cut himself badly. And George tried a pair of scissors, and the scissors flew up and nearly put his eye out. While they were dressing their wounds, I tried to make a hole in the thing with the spiky end of the hitcher, and the hitcher slipped and jerked me out between the boat and the bank into 2 feet of muddy water, and the tin rolled over, uninjured, and broke a teacup. Then we all got mad. We took that tin out of the bank, and Harris went up into the field and got a big sharp stone, and I went back to the boat and brought out the mast, and George held the tin, and Harris held the sharp end of his stone against the top of it, and I took the mast and poised it high up in the air and gathered up all my strength and brought it down. It was George's straw hat that saved his life that day. He keeps that hat now, well, what's left of it. And of a winter's evening, when the pipes are lit and the boys are telling stretchers about the dangers they've passed through, George brings it down and shows it round, and the stirring tale is told anew, with fresh exaggeration every time. Harris got off with merely a flesh wound. After that, I took the tin off myself and hammered at it with a mast till I was worn out and sick at heart, whereupon Harris took it in hand. We beat it out flat, we beat it back square, we battered it into every form known to geometry, but we could not make a hole in it. Then George went at it and knocked it into a shape so strange, so weird, so unearthly in its wild hideousness that he got frightened and threw away the mast. Then we all three sat round on the grass and looked at it. There was one great dent across the top that had the appearance of a mocking grin, and it drove us furious. So that Harris rushed at the thing and caught it up and flung it far into the middle of the river. And as it sank, we hurled our curses at it. And we got into the boat and rowed away from the spot and never paused till we reached Maidenhead. By Sunday evening, we reached Marlow, and there we left the boat by the bridge and went and put up for the night at the Crown. The next morning, we got up tolerably early and went for a bathe before breakfast. And coming back, Montmorency made an awful ass of himself. The only subject upon which Montmorency and I have any serious difference of opinion is cats. I like cats. Montmorency does not. When I meet a cat, I say, "Poor pussy," and stoop down and tickle the side of its head, and the cat sticks up its tail in a rigid cast-iron manner, arches its back, and wipes its nose up against my trousers, and all is gentleness and peace. When Montmorency meets a cat, the whole street knows about it, and there's enough bad language wasted in 10 seconds to last an ordinary respectable man all his life, with care. I don't blame the dog, contenting myself as a rule with merely clouting his head or throwing stones at him, because I take it that it's his nature. Fox terriers are born with about 4 times as much original sin in them as other dogs are, and it'll take years and years of patient effort on the part of us Christians to bring about any appreciable reformation in the rowdiness of the fox terrier nature. I remember being in the lobby of the Haymarket stores one day, and all around me were dogs, waiting for the return of their owners who were shopping inside. There were a Mastiff, 1 or 2 collies and a St. Bernard, a few retrievers and Newfoundlands, a boarhound, a French poodle with plenty of hair round its head, but mangy about the middle, a bulldog, a few Lowther Arcade sort of animals about the size of rats, and a couple of Yorkshire tykes. And there they sat, patient, good and thoughtful. A solemn peacefulness seemed to reign in that lobby. An air of calmness and resignation, of gentle sadness pervaded the room. Then a sweet young lady entered, leading a meek-looking little fox terrier, and left him chained up there between the bulldog and the poodle. He sat and looked about him for a minute. Then he cast his eyes to the ceiling and seemed, judging from his expression, to be thinking of his mother. Then he yawned. Then he looked around at the other dogs, all silent, grave and dignified. He looked at the bulldog, sleeping dreamlessly on his right. He looked at the poodle, erect and haughty on his left. Then, without a word of warning, without the shadow of a provocation, he bit that poodle's left foreleg, and a yelp of agony rang through the quiet shades of that lobby. The result of his first experiment seemed highly satisfactory to him, and he determined to go on and make things lively all round. He sprang over the poodle and vigorously attacked a collie. The collie woke up and immediately commenced a fierce and noisy contest with the poodle. Then Foxy came back to his own place and caught the bulldog by the ear and tried to throw him away, and the bulldog, a curiously impartial animal, went for everything he could reach, including the hall porter, which gave that dear little terrier the opportunity to enjoy an uninterrupted fight of his own with an equally willing Yorkshire tyke. Anyone who knows canine nature need hardly be told that by this time all the other dogs in the place were fighting as if their hearths and homes depended upon the fray. The big dogs fought each other indiscriminately, and the little dogs fought amongst themselves and filled up their spare time by biting the legs of the big dogs. And in the midst of this riot, that sweet young lady returned and snatched up that sweet little dog of hers. He had laid the tyke up for a month and had on the expression now of a newborn lamb, into her arms and kissed him and asked him if he was killed and what those great nasty brutes of dogs had been doing to him. Such is the nature of fox terriers, and therefore I don't blame Montmorency for his tendency to row with cats. But he wished he had not given way to it that morning. We were, as I've said, returning from a dip, and halfway up the high street, a cat darted out from one of the houses in front of us and began to trot across the road. Montmorency gave a cry of joy, the cry of a stern warrior who sees his enemy given over to his hands, and flew after his prey. His victim was a large black tom. I never saw a larger cat, nor a more disreputable-looking cat. It had lost half its tail, one of its ears, and a fairly appreciable portion of its nose. It was a long, sinewy-looking animal. It had a calm, contented air about it. Montmorency went for the poor cat at a rate of 20 miles an hour. But the cat did not hurry up, did not seem to have grasped the idea that its life was in danger. It trotted quietly on till its would-be assassin was within a yard of it, and then it turned round and sat down in the middle of the road and looked at Montmorency with a gentle, inquiring expression that said,
"Yes, you want me?"
Montmorency does not lack pluck, but there was something about the look of that cat that might have chilled the heart of the boldest dog. He stopped abruptly and looked back at Tom. Neither spoke, but the conversation that one could imagine was clearly as follows.
"Can I do anything for you?"
No, no thanks.
"Don't you mind speaking if you really want anything, you know?"
Oh, no,
said Montmorency, backing down the high street.
not at all. No, certainly. Don't trouble. No, I'm afraid I've made a mistake. I thought I knew you. Sorry I disturbed you.
"Not at all. Quite a pleasure. Sure you don't want anything now?"
Not at all.
said Montmorency, still backing.
Thanks. No, not at all. No, very kind of you. Good morning.
"Good morning."
Then the cat rose and continued his trot, and Montmorency, fitting what he calls his tail carefully into its groove, came back to us and took up an unimportant position in the rear. To this day, if you say the word cats to Montmorency, he will visibly shrink and look up piteously at you, as if to say,
Oh, please don't.
We did our marketing after breakfast and revictualled the boat for 3 days. George said we ought to take vegetables, that it was unhealthy not to eat vegetables. He said they were easy enough to cook and that he would see to that. So we got 10 pounds of potatoes, a bushel of peas, and a few cabbages. We got a beefsteak pie, a couple of gooseberry tarts, and a leg of mutton from the hotel, fruit, cakes, and bread and butter, and jam, and bacon and eggs, and other things we foraged around for in the town. Our departure from Marlow I regard as one of the greatest successes. It was dignified and impressive, without being ostentatious. We had insisted, at all the shops we'd been to, that the things should be sent with us then and there. None of your, "Oh, yes, sir, I'll send them off to you at once. The boy will be down there before you are, sir," and then fooling about on the landing stage and going back to the shop twice to have a row about them for us. Oh, no. We waited while the basket was packed and took the boy with us. We went to a good many shops, adopting this principle at each one, and the consequence was that by the time we'd finished, we had as fine a collection of boys with baskets following us around as heart could desire, and our final march down the middle of the high street to the river must have been as imposing a spectacle as Marlow had seen for many a long day. The order of the procession was as follows. Montmorency carrying a stick, 2 disreputable-looking curs, friends of Montmorency's, George carrying coats and rugs and smoking a short pipe, Harris trying to walk with easy grace while carrying a bulged-out Gladstone bag in one hand and a bottle of lime juice in the other, greengrocer's boy and baker's boy with baskets, Boots from the hotel carrying hamper, confectioner's boy with basket, grocer's boy with basket, long-haired dog, cheesemonger's boy with basket, odd man carrying a bag, bosom companion of odd man, with his hands in his pockets, smoking a short clay, fruiterer's boy with basket, myself carrying 3 hats and a pair of boots and trying to look as if I didn't know it, 6 small boys and 4 stray dogs. When we got down to the landing stage, the boatman said,
"Oh, let me see, sir. Was yours a steam launch or a houseboat?"
On our informing him that it was merely a double-sculling skiff, he seemed surprised. We had a good deal of trouble with steam launches that morning. It was just before the Henley week, and they were going up in large numbers, some by themselves, some towing houseboats. I do hate steam launches. I suppose every rowing man does. I never see a steam launch, but I feel I should like to lure it into some lonely part of the river, and there, in the silence and the solitude, strangle it. There's a blatant bumptiousness about a steam launch that has the knack of rousing every evil instinct in my nature. And I yearn for the good old days when you could go about and tell people what you thought of them with a hatchet and bow and arrows. The expression on the face of the man who, with his hands in his pockets, stands by the stern smoking a cigar is sufficient to excuse a breach of the peace by itself. And the lordly whistle for you to get out of the way would, I am confident, ensure a verdict of justifiable homicide from any jury of rivermen. They used to have to whistle for us to get out of their way. If I may do so without appearing boastful, I think I can honestly say that our one small boat during that week caused more annoyance and delay and aggravation to the steam launches that we came across than all the other craft on the river put together. "Steam launch coming!" one of us would cry out on sighting the enemy in the distance, and in an instant everything was got ready to receive her. I would take the lines, and Harris and George would sit down beside me, all of us with our backs to the launch, and the boat would drift out quietly into midstream. On would come the launch, whistling, and on we would go, drifting. At about 100 yards off, she would start whistling like mad, and the people would come and lean over the side and roar at us. But we never heard them. Harris would be telling us an anecdote about his mother, and George and I would not have missed a word of it for worlds. Then the launch would give one final shriek of the whistle that would nearly burst the boiler, and she would reverse her engines and blow off steam, and swing around and get aground. Everybody on board of it would rush to the bow and yell at us, and the people on the bank would stand and shout at us, and all the other passing boats would stop and join in, till the whole river for miles up and down was in a state of frantic commotion. And then Harris would break off in the midst of a most interesting part of his narrative and look up with mild surprise and say to George, "Why, George, bless us, if here isn't a steam launch!" And George would answer, "Well, do you know, I thought I heard something." Upon which we would get nervous and confused and not know how to get the boat out of the way, and the people in the launch would crowd around and instruct us. "Pull to your right! You idiot! Back with your left! No, not you, the other one! Leave the lines alone, can't you? Now, both together! Not that way! Oh, you..." Then they would lower a boat and come to our assistance, and after a quarter of an hour's effort would get us clean out of the way so that they could go on. We would thank them so much and ask them to give us a tow, but they never would. We found ourselves short of water at Hambledon Lock, so we took our jar and went up to the lock-keeper's house to beg for some. George was our spokesman. He put on a winning smile and said, "Oh, please, could you spare us a little water?" "Oh, certainly," replied the old gentleman. "Take as much as you want and leave the rest." "Oh, thank you so much," murmured George, looking about him. Where do you keep it?" "It's always in the same place, my boy," was the stolid reply. "Just behind you." "I don't see it," said George, turning around. "Why, bless us, where's your eyes?" was the man's comment, as he twisted George round and pointed up and down the stream. "There's enough of it to see, ain't there?" "Oh," exclaimed George, grasping the idea. "But we can't drink the river, you know." "No, but you can drink some of it," replied the old fellow. "It's what I've drunk for the last 15 years. George told him that his appearance after the course did not seem a sufficiently good advertisement for the brand, and that he would prefer it out of the pump. We tried river water once, later on in the season, but it was not a success. We were coming downstream and had pulled up to have tea in a backwater near Windsor. Our jar was empty, and it was a case of going without our tea or taking water from the river. So we filled our kettle with Thames backwater and boiled it, and very careful we were to see that it did boil. We had made the tea and were just settling down comfortably to drink it when George, with his cup halfway to his lips, paused and exclaimed, "What's that?" "What's what?" asked Harris and I. "Why, that," said George, looking westward. Harris and I followed his gaze and saw, coming down towards us on the sluggish current, a dog. It was one of the quietest and peacefulest dogs I have ever seen. I have never met a dog who seemed more contented, more easy in its mind. It was floating dreamily on its back, with its 4 legs stuck up straight into the air. It was what I would call a full-bodied dog with a well-developed chest. On he came, serene, dignified and calm, until he was abreast of our boat, and there, among the rushes, he eased up and settled down cosily for the evening. George said he didn't want any tea and emptied his cup into the water. Harris didn't feel thirsty either and followed suit. I had drunk half of mine, but I wished I had not. We went up the backwater to Wargrave. It's a short cut, leading out of the right-hand bank about half a mile above Marshlock. It's well worth taking, being a pretty, shady little piece of stream, besides saving nearly half a mile of distance. Then, after lunch, we caught a breeze, which took us gently up past Wargrave and Shiplake. Mellowed in the drowsy sunlight of a summer's afternoon, Wargrave, nestling where the river bends, makes a sweet old picture as you pass it, and one that lingers upon the retina of memory. The river up to Sonning winds in and out through many islands and is very placid, hushed and lonely. Few folk, except at twilight a pair or two of rustic lovers, walk along its banks. Henley has been left far behind, and dismal, dirty Reading is not yet reached. It's a part of the river in which to dream of bygone days and vanished forms and faces, of things that might have been, but are not, confound them. We roamed about sweet Sonning for an hour or so, and then, it being too late to push on past Reading, we decided to go back to one of those Shiplake Islands and put up there for the night. It was still early when we got settled, and George said that, as we had plenty of time, it'd be a splendid opportunity to try a good slap-up supper. He said he would show us what could be done up the river in the way of cooking, and suggested that, with the vegetables and the remains of the cold beef and general odds and ends, we should make an Irish stew. It seemed a fascinating idea. George gathered wood and made a fire, and Harris and I began to peel the potatoes. I should never have thought that peeling potatoes was such an undertaking. The job turned out to be the biggest thing of its kind that I had ever been in. We began cheerfully, one might almost say skittishly, but our light-heartedness was gone by the time the first potato was finished. The more we peeled, the more peel there seemed to be left on, and by the time we got all the peel off and all the eyes out, there was no potato left, at least none worth speaking of. George came and had a look at it. It was about the size of a peanut. He said, "Oh, that won't do. You're wasting them. You must scrape them." So we scraped them. And that was harder work than peeling. There's an extraordinary shape, potatoes, all bumps and warts and hollows. We worked steadily for 25 minutes and did 4 potatoes. Then we struck. We said we should require the rest of the evening for scraping ourselves. I never saw such a thing as potato scraping for making a fellow in a mess. It seemed difficult to believe that the potato scrapings in which Harris and I stood half smothered could have come off 4 potatoes. It shows you what can be done with economy and care. George said it was absurd to have only 4 potatoes in an Irish stew, so we washed half a dozen or so more and put them in without peeling. We also put in a cabbage and about half a peck of peas. George stirred it all up, and then he said that there seemed to be a lot of room to spare, so we overhauled both the hampers and picked out all the odds and ends and the remnants and added them to the stew. There were half a pork pie and a bit of cold boiled bacon left, so we put them in. Then George found half a tin of potted salmon, and he emptied that into the pot. He said that was the advantage of Irish stew. You got rid of such a lot of things. I fished out a couple of eggs that had got cracked, and we put those in. And George said they would thicken the gravy. I forget the other ingredients, but I know that nothing was wasted. And I remember that towards the end, Montmorency, who had evinced great interest in the proceedings throughout, strolled away with an earnest and thoughtful air, reappearing a few minutes afterwards with a dead water rat in his mouth, which he evidently wished to present as his contribution to the dinner. Whether in a sarcastic spirit or with a genuine desire to assist, I cannot say. It was a great success, that Irish stew. I don't think I ever enjoyed a meal more. There was something so fresh and piquant about it. One's palate gets so tired of the old hackneyed things. Here was a dish with a new flavour, with a taste like nothing else on earth. And it was nourishing, too. As George said, there was good stuff in it. The peas and potatoes might have been a bit softer, but we had good teeth, so it didn't matter much. And as for the gravy, it was a poem. A little too rich, perhaps, for a weak stomach, but nutritious. George got out his banjo after supper and wanted to play it, but Harris objected. He said he had a headache and didn't feel strong enough to stand it. George thought the music might do him good, said music often soothed the nerves and took away a headache, and he twanged 2 or 3 notes just to show Harris what it was like. Harris said he'd rather have the headache. George has never learned to play the banjo to this day. He's had too much all-round discouragement to meet. He tried on 2 or 3 evenings while we were up the river to get a little practice, but it was never a success. Harris's language used to be enough to unnerve any man, added to which Montmorency would sit and howl steadily right through the performance. He wasn't giving the man a fair chance. "What's he want to howl like that for when I'm playing?" George would exclaim indignantly, while taking aim at him with a boot. "What do you want to play like that for when he's howling?" Harris would retort, catching the boot. "You let him alone. He can't help howling. He has a musical ear, and your playing makes him howl." Harris was altogether disagreeable after supper. I think it must have been the stew which had upset him. He's not used to high living. So George and I left him in the boat and settled to go for a mooch round Henley. He said he would have a glass of whisky and a pipe and fix things up for the night. We were to shout when we returned, and he would row over from the island and fetch us. "Don't go to sleep, old man," we said as we started. "Not much fear of that while this stew is on," he grunted, as he pulled back to the island. Henley was getting ready for the regatta, and was full of bustle. We met a goodish number of men we knew about the town, and In their pleasant company, the time slipped by somewhat quickly, so it was nearly 11 o'clock before we set off on our 4-mile walk home, as we had learnt to call our little craft by this time. It was a dismal night, coldish, with a thin rain falling, and as we trudged through the dark, silent fields, talking low to each other and wondering if we were going right or not, we thought of the cosy boat, with the bright lights streaming through the tight-drawn canvas, of Harris and Montmorency, and the whisky, and wished that we were there. We struck the towpath at length, and that made us happy, because prior to this we'd not been sure whether we were walking towards the river or away from it. And when you're tired and want to go to bed, uncertainties like that worry you. We passed Shiplake as the clock was striking the 12:15, and then George said, thoughtfully, "You don't happen to remember which of the islands it was, do you?" "No," I replied, beginning to grow thoughtful too. "I don't. How many are there?" "Only 4, answered George. "Oh, it'll be all right, if he's awake." "And if not?" I queried, but we dismissed that train of thought. We shouted when we came opposite the first island, but there was no response. So we went on to the second, and tried there, and obtained the same result. "Oh, I remember now," said George. "It was the third one." And we ran on hopefully to the third one, and hallooed. No answer. The case was becoming serious. It was now past midnight. We despairingly tried, what seemed in the darkness, to be the 4th island, but met with no better success. The rain was coming down fast now, and evidently meant to last. We were wet to the skin, and cold and miserable. We began to wonder whether there were only 4 islands or more, or whether we were near the islands at all, or whether we were anywhere within a mile of where we ought to be, or in the wrong part of the river altogether. Just when we'd given up all hope, I suddenly caught sight, a little way below us, of a strange, weird sort of glimmer flickering amongst the trees on the opposite bank. For an instant, I thought of ghosts. It was such a shadowy, mysterious light. The next moment, it flashed across me that it was our boat, and I sent up such a yell across the water that made the night seem to shake in its bed. We waited, breathless for a minute, and then, oh, divinest of music in the darkness, we heard the answering bark of Montmorency. We shouted back, loud enough to wake the 7 sleepers, and after what seemed an hour, what was really, I suppose, only 5 minutes, we saw the lighted boat creeping slowly over the blackness, and heard Harris's sleepy voice asking where we were. There was an unaccountable strangeness about Harris. It was something more than mere ordinary tiredness. He pulled the boat against a part of the bank from which it was quite impossible for us to get into, and immediately went to sleep. It took us an immense amount of screaming and roaring to wake him up again and put some sense into him, but we succeeded at last and got safely on board. Harris had a sad expression on him, so we noticed, when we got into the boat. He gave you the idea of a man who'd been through trouble. We asked him if anything had happened, and he said,
"Swans."
It seemed we had moored close to a swan's nest, and soon after George and I had gone, the female swan came back and kicked up a row about it. Harris had chivied her off, and she'd gone away and fetched up her old man. Harris said he'd had quite a fight with those 2 swans, but courage and skill had prevailed in the end, and he had defeated them. Half an hour afterwards, they returned with 18 other swans. It must have been a fearful battle, so far as we could understand Harris's account of it. The swans had tried to drag him and Montmorency out of the boat and drown them, and he defended himself like a hero for 4 hours and had killed the lot, and they had all paddled away to die.
"How many swans do you say there were?"
asked George.
32,
replied Harris, sleepily.
"You said 18 just now,"
said George.
"No, I didn't,"
grunted Harris.
"I said 12. You think I can't count?"
I slept well that night, and should have slept better if it had not been for Harris. I have a vague recollection of having been woken up at least a dozen times during the night by Harris wandering about the boat with the lantern, looking for his clothes. He seemed to be worrying about his clothes all night. Twice he routed up George and myself to ask if we were lying on his trousers. George got quite wild the second time.
What the thunder do you want your trousers for in the middle of the night? He asked indignantly. Why don't you lie down and go to sleep?
I found him in trouble the next time I awoke because he could not find his socks. And my last hazy remembrance is of being rolled over on my side and of hearing Harris muttering something about its being an extraordinary thing where his umbrella could have got to. The river becomes very lovely from a little above Reading, and from Maple Durham up to Streatley it is glorious. The neighbourhood of Streatley and Goring is a great fishing centre. There's some excellent fishing to be had there. The river abounds in pike, roach, dace, gudgeon and eels just here, and you can sit and fish for them all day. The Angler's Guide to the Thames says that jack and perch are also to be had about here, but there the Angler's Guide is wrong. Jack and perch may be about there, indeed I know for a fact they are. You can see them there in shoals. When you're out for a walk along the banks, they come and stand half out of the water with their mouths open for biscuits. And if you go for a bathe, they crowd around and get in your way and irritate you. But they are not to be had by a bit of worm on the end of a hook, or anything like that. Oh, not they. I'm not a good fisherman myself. I devoted a considerable amount of attention to the subject at one time, and was getting on, I thought, fairly well. But the old hands told me that I should never be any real good at it, and advised me to give it up. They said that I was an extremely neat thrower, and that I seemed to have plenty of gumption for the thing, and quite enough constitutional laziness. But they were sure I should never make anything of a fisherman. I had not got sufficient imagination. Some people are under the impression that all that's required to make a good fisherman is the ability to tell lies easily and without blushing. But this is a mistake. Mere bald fabrication is useless. The veriest tyro can manage that. It's in the circumstantial detail, the embellishing touches of probability, the general air of scrupulous, almost of pedantic veracity that the experienced angler is seen. Anybody can come in and say, I caught 15 dozen perch yesterday evening, or last Monday I landed a gudgeon weighing 18 pounds and measuring 3 feet. There is no art, no skill required for that sort of thing. It shows pluck, but that is all. No, your accomplished angler would scorn to tell a lie that way. His method is a study in itself. He comes in quietly with his hat on, appropriates the most comfortable chair, lights his pipe, and commences to puff in silence. He lets the youngsters brag away for a while, and then, during a momentary lull, he removes the pipe from his mouth and remarks, as he knocks the ashes out against the bars, Well, I had a haul on Tuesday evening that is not much good my telling anybody about. Oh, why's that? They ask. Because I don't expect anybody would believe me if I did, replies the old fellow calmly, and without even a tinge of bitterness in his tone, as he refills his pipe and requests the landlord to bring him 3 of Scotch, cold. There's a pause after this. Nobody feels sufficiently sure of himself to contradict the old gentleman, so he has to go on by himself without any encouragement. No, he continues thoughtfully, I shouldn't believe it myself if anyone told it to me, but it is a fact for all that. I'd been sitting there all the afternoon and had caught literally nothing, except a few dozen dace and a score of jack, and I was just about giving it up as a bad job when I suddenly felt a rather smart pull at the line. I thought it was just another little one, and I went to jerk it up. Well, hang me if I could move the rod. It took me half an hour, yes, half an hour, sir, to land that fish, and every moment I thought the line was going to snap. Well, I reached him at last, and what do you think it was? A sturgeon, a 40-pound sturgeon, taken on a line, sir. Yes, you may well look surprised. I will have another 3 of Scotch, landlord, please. If ever you have an evening to spare up the river, I should advise you to drop in at one of the local village inns and take a seat in the taproom. You'll be nearly sure to meet 1 or 2 old rodmen sipping their toddy there, and they'll tell you enough fishy stories in half an hour to give you indigestion for a month. George and I don't know what had become of Harris. He'd gone out and had a shave early in the afternoon, and had then come back and spent a full 40 minutes in pipe-claying his shoes, and we hadn't seen him since. But George and I, therefore, and the dog, left to ourselves, went for a walk to Wallingford on the second evening, and coming home, we called in at the little riverside inn for a rest, and other things. We went to the parlour and sat down, and there was an old fellow there smoking a long clay pipe, and we naturally began chatting. He told us that it had been a fine day today, and we told him that it had been a fine day yesterday, and then we all told each other that we thought it would be a fine day tomorrow, and George said, "The crops seem to be coming up nicely." Well, after that it came out, somehow or other, that we were strangers in the neighbourhood, and that we were going away the next morning. Then a pause ensued in the conversation, during which our eyes wandered round the room, and they finally rested upon a dusty old glass case, fixed very high up above the chimney-piece, and containing a trout. It rather fascinated me, this trout. It was such a monstrous fish. In fact, at first glance, I thought it was a cod.
"Arr!"
said the old gentleman, following the direction of my gaze.
"Fine fellow that, ain't he?"
"Quite uncommon," I murmured, and George asked the old man how much he thought it weighed.
18 pound, 6 ounces,
said our friend, rising and taking down his coat.
"Yes," he continued. "It were 16 years ago, come the 3rd of next month, that I landed him. I caught him just below the bridge with a minnow. They told me he were in the river, and I said I'd have him. So I did. Oh, you don't see many fish that size about here now, I'm a-thinking. Good night, gentlemen, good night."
And out he went, and left us alone. We couldn't take our eyes off the fish after that. It really was a remarkably fine fish. We were still looking at it when the local carrier, who just stopped at the inn, came to the door of the room with a pot of beer in his hand, and he also looked at the fish. "A good-sized trout, that," said George, turning round to him.
You may well say that, sir,"
replied the man. And then, after a pull at his beer, he added,
"Maybe you wasn't here, sir, when that fish was caught."
"No," we told him. "We were strangers in the neighbourhood."
Said the carrier. "Then, of course, how should you? It was nearly 5 years ago that I caught that trout."
"Oh, it was you who caught it then," said I.
"Yes, sir,"
replied the genial old fellow.
"I caught him just below the lock. Leastways, what was the lock then? Yes, one Friday afternoon. And the remarkable thing about it is that I caught him with a fly. Yes, I'd gone out pike fishing, bless you, never thinking of a trout, and when I saw that whopper on the end of my line, blessed if it didn't take me quite aback. Well, you see, he weighed 26 pound. Good night, gentlemen, good night."
5 minutes afterwards, a third man came in and described how he had caught it early one morning with bleak. And then he left. And a stolid, solemn-looking, middle-aged individual came in and sat down over by the window. None of us spoke for a while, but at length George turned to the newcomer and said, I beg your pardon. I hope you'll forgive the liberty that we, perfect strangers in the neighbourhood, are taking, but my friend here and myself would be so much obliged if you would tell us how you caught that trout up there."
Why, who told you I caught that trout?
Was a surprised query. We said that nobody had told us, but somehow or other we felt instinctively that it was he who done it.
Well, it's the most remarkable thing, yeah, most remarkable,
answered the stolid stranger, laughing.
Because, as a matter of fact, you're quite right, yes, I did catch it. But fancy your guessing it like that. Well, dear me, it's really the most remarkable thing.
And then he went on and told us how it had taken him half an hour to land it and how it had broken his rod. He said he weighed it carefully when he reached home, and it turned the scale at 34 pounds. He went in his turn, and when he was gone, the landlord came in to us. We told him the various histories we'd heard about his trout, and he was immensely amused, and we all laughed very heartily.
Fancy Jim Bates and Joe Muggles and Mr. Jones and old Billy Maunders all telling you that they'd caught it.
Well, that's good, said the honest old fellow, laughing heartily. And then he told us the real history of the fish. It seemed that he had caught it himself, years ago, when he was quite a lad. Not by any art or skill, but by that unaccountable luck that appears to always wait upon a boy when he plays wag from school and goes out fishing on a sunny afternoon with a bit of string tied to the end of a tree. He said that bringing home that trout had saved him from a whacking, and that even his schoolmaster had said It was worth the rule of 3 and practice put together. He was called out of the room at this point, and George and I turned our gaze upon the fish. It really was the most astounding trout. The more we looked at it, the more we marvelled at it. It excited George so much that he climbed up on the back of a chair to get a better view of it. And then the chair slipped, and George clutched wildly at the trout case to save himself, and down it came with a crash, George and the chair on top of it. "Oh, you haven't injured the fish, have you?" I cried in alarm, rushing up.
Oh, I hope
"Not," said George, rising cautiously and looking about. But he had. That trout lay shattered into 1,000 fragments. I say 1,000, but they may have been only 900. I didn't count them. We thought it strange and unaccountable that a stuffed trout should break up into little pieces like that. And so it would have been strange and unaccountable if it had been a stuffed trout. But it was not. That trout was plaster of Paris. We left Streatley early in the next morning and pulled up to Culham and slept under canvas in the backwater there. The river isn't extraordinarily interesting between Streatley and Wallingford. From Cleeve, you get a stretch of 6.5 miles without a lock, and I believe this is the longest uninterrupted stretch anywhere above Teddington, and the Oxford Club make use of it for their Trial 8. But however satisfactory this absence of locks may be to rowing men, it is to be regretted by the mere pleasure seeker. For myself, I'm fond of locks. They pleasantly break the monotony of the pull. I like sitting in the boat and slowly rising out of the cool depths up into new reaches and fresh views, or sinking down, as it were, out of the world, and then waiting while the gloomy gates creak and the narrow strip of daylight between them widens till the fair, smiling river lies full before you, and you push your little boat out from its brief prison onto the welcoming waters once again. Talking of locks reminds me of an accident that George and I very nearly had one summer's morning at Hampton Court. It was a glorious day, and the lock was crowded, and, as is a common practice up the river, a speculative photographer was taking a picture of us all as we lay upon the rising waters. I didn't catch what was going on at first, and was therefore extremely surprised at noticing George hurriedly smooth out his trousers, ruffle his hair, and stick his cap on at a rakish manner at the back of his head, and then, assuming an expression of mingled affability and sadness, sit down in a graceful attitude and try to hide his feet. My first idea was that he'd suddenly caught sight of some girl he knew, and I looked about to see who it was. Everybody in the lock seemed to have been suddenly struck wooden. They were all standing or sitting about in the most quaint and curious attitudes I have ever seen off a Japanese fan. All the girls were smiling. Oh, they did look so sweet. And all the fellows were frowning and looking stern and noble. And then at last the truth flashed across me, and I wondered if I should be in time. Ours was the first boat, and it would be unkind of me to spoil the man's picture, I thought. So I faced round quickly and took up a position in the prow, where I leant with careless grace upon the hitcher, in an attitude suggestive of agility and strength. I arranged my hair with a curl over the forehead and threw an air of tender wistfulness into my expression, mingled with a touch of cynicism, which I'm told suits me. As we stood, waiting for the eventful moment, I heard someone behind call out,
Hey, look at your nose!
I couldn't turn round to see what was the matter, and whose nose it was that was to be looked at. I stole a side glance at George's nose. It was all right. At all events, there was nothing wrong with it that could be altered, and I squinted down at my own nose, and that seemed to be all that could be expected also.
Look at your nose, you stupid ass!
Came the same voice again, louder, and then another voice cried,
Push your nose out, can't you? You two with a dog.
Neither George nor I dared to turn round. The man's hand was on the cap, and the picture might be taken any moment. Was it us they were calling to? What was the matter with our noses? Why were they to be pushed out? But now the whole lot began to yell, and a stentorian voice from the back shouted, Look at your boat, sir! You, in the red and black caps! It's your 2 corpses that'll be taken in that photo if you ain't quick! We looked then, and saw that the nose of our boats had got fixed under the woodwork of the lock, while the incoming water was rising all around it and tilting it up. In another moment we should be over. Well, as quick as thought, we each seized an oar, and a vigorous blow against the side of the lock with our butt ends released the boat and sent us sprawling on our backs. We did not come out well in that photograph, George and I. Of course, as was to be expected, our luck ordained it that the man should set his wretched machine in motion at the precise moment that we were both lying on our backs with a wild expression of "Where am I?" and "What is it?" on our faces, and our feet waving in the air. Our feet were undoubtedly the leading article of that photograph. Indeed, very little else was to be seen. They filled up the foreground entirely, and behind them you caught glimpses of the other boats and bits of the surrounding scenery. But everything and everybody else in the loch looked so utterly insignificant and paltry compared with our feet that all the other people felt quite ashamed of themselves and refused to subscribe to the picture. We passed through Iffley Lock at about 12:30, and then, having tidied up the boat and made all ready for landing, we set to work on our last mile, to Oxford. We spent 2 very pleasant days at Oxford, but on the 3rd day the weather changed, and we started from Oxford upon our homeward journey in the midst of a steady drizzle. We rode on all that day through the rain, and very melancholy work it was. We pretended at first that we enjoyed it. We said it was a change, that we liked to see the river under all its different aspects. We said we shouldn't expect to have it all sunshine, nor should we wish it. We told each other that nature was beautiful, even in her tears. Indeed, Harris and I were quite enthusiastic about the business for the first few hours, and we sang a song about a gypsy's life and how delightful a gypsy's existence was, free to storm and sunshine and to every wind that blew, and how he enjoyed the rain and what a lot of good it did him, and how he laughed at people who didn't like it. George took the fun more soberly and stuck to the umbrella. We hoisted the cover before we had lunch and kept it up all the afternoon, just leaving a little space in the bow from which one of us could paddle and keep a lookout. In this way we made 9 miles and pulled up for the night a little below Day's Lock. I cannot honestly say that we had a merry evening. The rain poured down with quiet persistency. Everything in the boat was damp and clammy. Supper was not a success. Cold veal pie, when you don't feel hungry, is apt to cloy. I felt I wanted whitebait and a cutlet, and Harris babbled of soles and white sauce, and passed the remains of his pie to Montmorency, who declined it, and apparently, insulted by the offer, went and sat over at the other end of the boat by himself. George requested that we would not talk about these things, at all events until he'd finished his cold boiled beef without mustard. After that, we mixed ourselves some toddy and sat around and talked. George told us about a man he'd known once who'd come up the river 2 years ago, who'd slept out in a damp boat on just such another night as that was, and it had given him rheumatic fever, and nothing was able to save him. And he died in great agony 10 days afterwards. George said he was quite a young man and was engaged to be married. He said it was one of the saddest things he had ever known. And that put Harris in mind of a friend of his who'd been in the volunteers and who had slept out under canvas one wet night down at Aldershot. On just such another night as this, said Harris, and he'd woken up in the morning a cripple for life. Harris said he'd introduce us both to the man when we got back to town. It would make our hearts bleed to see him. Well, this naturally led to some pleasant chat about sciatica, fever, chills, lung diseases and bronchitis, and Harry said how very awkward it would be if one of us were taken seriously ill in the night, seeing how far away we were from a doctor. There seemed to be a desire for something frolicsome to follow up this conversation, and in a weak moment I suggested that George should get out his banjo and see if he could give us a comic song. I will say for George, he did not want any pressing. There was no nonsense about having left his music at home or anything of that sort. He at once fished out his instrument and commenced to play Two Lovely Black Eyes. I'd always regarded Two Lovely Black Eyes as rather a commonplace tune until that evening. The rich vein of sadness that George extracted from it quite surprised me. The desire that grew upon Harris and myself as the mournful strains progressed was to fall on each other's necks and weep. But by great effort we kept back the rising tears and listened to the wild, yearnful melody in silence. When the chorus came, we made a desperate effort to be merry. We refilled our glasses and joined in, Harris in a voice trembling with emotion leading, and George and I followed a few words behind.
Two lovely black eyes, oh, what a surprise! only for telling a man he was wrong to do.
There we broke down. The unutterable pathos of George's accompaniment to that "too" we were, in our then state of depression, unable to bear. Harris sobbed like a little child, and the dog howled, till I thought his heart, or his jaw, must surely break. George wanted to go on with another verse. He thought that when he'd got a little more into the tune, he could throw more abandon, as it were, into the rendering, and it might not seem quite so sad. The feeling of the majority was, however, opposed to the experiment. There being nothing else to do, we went to bed. Well, that is, we undressed ourselves and tossed about at the bottom of the boat for some 3 or 4 hours, after which we managed to get some fitful slumber until 5 a.m., when we all got up and had breakfast. The second day was exactly like the first. The rain continued to pour down, and we sat wrapped up in our mackintoshes underneath the canvas and drifted slowly down. One of us, I forget which one now, but I rather think it was myself, made a few feeble attempts during the course of the morning to work up the old gypsy foolishness about being children of nature and enjoying the wet. But it didn't go down at all well. That "I care not for the rain, not I," was so painfully evident as expressing the sentiments of each of us that to sing it seemed unnecessary. On one point we were all agreed, and that was that, come what might, we would go through with this job to the bitter end. We'd come out for a fortnight's enjoyment on the river, and a fortnight's enjoyment on the river we meant to have. If it killed us, well, that'd be a sad thing for our friends and relations, but it could not be helped. We felt that to give in to the weather in a climate such as ours would be a most disastrous precedent. "It's only 2 more days," said Harris, "and we are young and strong. We may get over it all right after all." At about 4 o'clock, we began to discuss our arrangements for the evening. We were a little past Goring then, and we decided to paddle on to Pangbourne and put up there for the night.
Another jolly evening,
murmured George. We sat and mused on the prospect. We should be in at Pangbourne by 5. We should finish our dinner at, say, 6:30. After that, we could walk about the village in the pouring rain until bedtime, or we could sit in a dimly lit bar parlour and read the almanac. "Why, the Alhambra would be almost more lively," said Harris, venturing his head outside the cover for a moment and taking a survey of the sky. "With a little supper at the Étoile to follow," I added, half unconsciously. "Yes, it's almost a pity we've made up our minds to stick to this boat," answered Harris. And then there was silence for a while. "If we hadn't made up our minds to contract our certain deaths in this bally old coffin," observed George, casting a glance of intense malevolence over the boat, it might be worthwhile to mention that there's a train leaves Pangbourne, I know, soon after 5, which would just land us in town in comfortable time to get a chop, and then go on to the place you mentioned afterwards." Nobody spoke. We looked at one another, and each one seemed to see his own mean and guilty thoughts reflected in the faces of the others. In silence, we dragged out and overhauled the Gladstone. We looked up the river and down the river. Not a soul was in sight. 20 minutes later, 3 figures, followed by a shamed-looking dog, might have been seen creeping stealthily from the boathouse of the Swan towards the railway station, dressed in the following neither neat nor gaudy costume: black leather shoes, dirty; suit of boating flannels, very dirty; brown felt hat, much battered; mackintosh, very wet; umbrella. We had deceived the boatman at Pangbourne. We'd not had the face to tell him that we were running away from the rain. We had left the boat and all it contained in his charge, with instructions that it was to be ready for us at 9 the next morning. If, we said, if anything unforeseen should happen preventing our return, we would write to him. We reached Paddington at 7 and drove direct to the restaurant that I have before described, where we partook of a light meal, left Montmorency together with suggestions for a supper to be ready at 10:30, and then continued our way to Leicester Square. We attracted a good deal of attention at the Alhambra. On our presenting ourselves at the pay-box, we were gruffly directed to go round to Castle Street, and were informed that we were half an hour behind our time. We convinced the man with some difficulty that we were not the world-renowned contortionists from the Himalaya mountains, and he took our money and let us pass. Inside, we were still a greater success. Our fine bronzed countenances and picturesque clothes were followed round the place with admiring gaze. We were the cynosure of every eye. It was a proud moment for us all. We adjourned soon after the first ballet and wended our way back to the restaurant, where supper was already awaiting us. Oh, I must confess to enjoying that supper. For about 10 days we seemed to have been living, more or less, on nothing but cold meat, cake and bread and jam. It had been a simple, nutritious diet, but there had been nothing exciting about it, and the odour of Burgundy and the smell of French sauces and the sight of clean napkins and long loaves knocked as a very welcome visitor at the door of our inner man. We pegged and quaffed away in silence for a while, until the time came when, instead of sitting bolt upright and grasping the knife and fork firmly, we leant back in our chairs and worked slowly and carelessly. When we stretched out our legs beneath the table, let our napkins fall unheeded to the floor, and found time to more critically examine the smoky ceiling than we had hitherto been able to, when we rested our glasses at arm's length upon the table and felt good and thoughtful and forgiving. Then Harris, who was sitting next to the window, drew aside the curtain and looked out upon the street. It glistened darkly in the wet. The dim lamps flickered with each gust. The rain splashed steadily into the puddles and trickled down the waterspouts into the running gutters. A few soaked wayfarers hurried past, crouching beneath their dripping umbrellas, the women holding up their skirts. "Well," said Harris, reaching his hand out for his glass, "we've had a pleasant trip, and my hearty thanks for it to old Father Thames. But I think we did well to chuck it when we did. Here's to 3 men well out of a boat." And Montmorency, standing on his hind legs before the window, peering out into the night, gave a short bark of decided concurrence with the toast.